Welcome to the Sensible Socialist Podcast, a podcast for the rational left.
We need to unite and work together if we're all going to get through this. Sounds like socialism to me.
The amount of people I see talking about socialism positively is actually staggering.
Do you think, do you really think that a proletarian revolution is just around the corner in America?
Grab your pitchforks and stab your mayor.
Your hero, Obama.
He's not my hero. I'm
How
not
heroic
fucking
he
idiot.
comes
If Bernie Sanders were president, right, and he wanted to bring the same ideas as for socialism into this country, do you think that we would benefit?
Yeah.
But I just told you Venezuela's eating rats.
But I just want people to have health care. I don't want,
Same thing Hugo Chavez.
oh my god. You people have, worms in your brain, honestly.
Welcome to the Sensible Socialist Podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Gustafson, and on this episode of the podcast, I am featuring a long but interesting conversation with a listener of the podcast. I wanted to make sure that regular people have the ability to talk to me and talk about socialism and anything, really. And so this conversation is pretty wide-ranging. We get into questions of morality and the labor theory of value and several other things about at least my views on socialism, communism, Marxism, morality, philosophy, and a bunch of different other things. So if you're listening to this podcast and you want to have a conversation with me, just reach out to me. You can either go to the sensiblesocialist.com website, or you can reach out to me on social media or send an email, sensiblesocialistpodcast@gmail.com, and we'll have a conversation. But without further ado, here's my conversation with a listener of the podcast. Now I think it's working. Cool.
Is it working?
Yeah, I can see you, I can hear you. Everything's cool.
Great.
All right. So, the way that I would start is just saying that my intention on starting a podcast was basically just for me to say the things that I think, have it out there, and if people find it interesting, cool. If people want to give me money on Patreon, cool. But it's not what I do for a job. I don't care about likes. I don't care about any of this kind of stuff. I'm just trying to put it out there to see if anybody likes it. And so one of the big things I said was I'm not going to try to seek out fame or seek out big name people just to promote myself or something like that. What I really wanted to do was have conversations with real people, regular people who, are interested in stuff but don't necessarily need to have published articles or YouTube pages or anything like that. Just regular people to have regular conversations for two reasons. One, to show that it's possible, and two, I think to see how two people who might disagree can do so in a way that promotes mutual understanding, that's done with mutual respect, and that's kind of honest and intentionally trying to get towards understanding rather than necessarily victory or rhetorical, cheap shots and all that kind of stuff. My genuine intention is to be able to have conversations with people who are regular people and who have perspectives, and I want to talk to them. So when you reached out to me, which I thought was cool, that's why I said I'd just like to have a conversation with you. And I think because if you're reaching out and saying that you want to, then you're interested enough to test the possibility of having a conversation. So with that, I'm curious in some ways just to kind of hear why you reached out to me, and whatever background about you or perspective where you're coming from that you think is relevant to kind of set up talking about whatever.
That's a good intro. I like it. It sets a good scene.
All right, cool.
No, it does. It's really good because it sets a scene that I think is conducive to actually having a good conversation.
Sure.
I've been interested in philosophy and theology and politics for a while.
Mm-hmm.
For the longest possible time, I would just listen to YouTube sort of stuff. right? So just absorbing this sort of information. Then at some point, I made a decision to, or felt a need to go and talk to people about it. So I jumped on Discord and jumped on like politics server and intellectual server and a few of these other servers. Most of them geared towards politics, but then I also found like an Orthodox religious server and various other servers. I'm currently working on getting access to Vorsh's server. It's quite painful because you have to I think they do some sort of social connection test to see if you're some sort of alt-right adjacent sort of person on Twitter or Twitch or something like that.
Okay.
And then you have to go through this process of actually validating yourself by I think you have to communicate enough in text without being objectionable. And then once you've done that enough, you can actually start, which the whole thing is terrible. Like it's awful because it's like gate fencing a dialogue.
Easier
which is
to
kind
get
of
into the
awful.
Communist Party of the Soviet Union than it is to get in Bosch's fucking Discord server.
Well, exactly. Yeah, it's kind of objectionable to me because I'm a free speech advocate. But basically, I've been on Discord servers talking to people about stuff, everything from politics to religion to economics to stuff. And I'm a noob. Like I'm not a trained speaker, and I'm certainly not a trained economist or politics commentary person or anything. I'm just I kind of a regular sort of person. I'd like to think I'm kind of intelligent and kind of informed. But I mean, I'll let the world be the judge of that for sure. But one of the problems with Discord servers is you spend, for every 20 minutes of great conversation that you have to wade through 20 hours of drivel and nonsense and rubbish.
Yep.
And it's quite painful. And so I've been wanting is the wrong word. I've been interested in having dialogue with people who seem reasonable. I want to have, when I have a conversation with someone, I'd like it to be constructive. I'd like there to be no, hyperbole or disingenuousness. I'd like an honest conversation with someone.
Yeah.
And you seemed very much that way when you were speaking with Destiny, which is where I first saw you. That was a good conversation, by the way.
Thanks. It was a long conversation.
Yeah, no, you presented yourself really well. It was actually refreshing. So what actually happened was I saw the debate between Richard Wolff and Destiny. And then I think you came on to talk to him about it or something. And one of the things that I found really obnoxious about that debate between Destiny and Richard Wolff was Richard Wolff couldn't even come up with a cogent, compelling definition for what form of socialism he would advocate for.
Yeah.
And I found that that was just super obnoxious. It was just crazy levels of obnoxious. I mean, if you're gonna posit a view of the world that you would like other people to adopt, then you have to make it clear, and you have to do it in such a way that it's succinctly clear, like concise. You need to be able to say, "Hey, this is what I want the world to look like," and you need to do it. You need to do it basically within an elevator pitch. I don't know if you know this term, but you got like 60 seconds to make an impression on someone, and you got to like literally explain an idea, and then kind of have it hit home enough to be of interest that they would then pursue a conversation more.
Yeah.
You literally got like 60 seconds, 2 minutes to do that. And if you can't do that, then you've kind of like failed. And I was really disappointed in that conversation, on a lot of levels. And the really bizarre thing was when I looked at the YouTube, I don't know if it's worth ever looking at YouTube comments, but when I looked at the YouTube comments, I just saw such tribalism. Fans of Destiny were like, you crushed him. He couldn't even define anything.
Yeah.
And then fans of Richard Wolff were like, I came for a debate and I got a great lecture and Destiny was a child. And it's like, surely there's some sort of middle ground here.
Yeah.
That is going on that should be obvious that, I don't know, maybe I'm just weird.
That was exactly my experience. Like,
yeah.
The funny thing about that is that I'm sitting here like watching that, and I just got notice of that because I have been a kind of contributing member to democracy at work since like 2016, 2017. Like I started a Democracy at Work study group in Washington D.C. We hosted a bunch of like talks and held just meetings talking about cooperative stuff. That eventually evolved into the All Things Co-op podcast, which is now a podcast that's like on the Democracy at Work YouTube page and on their website and stuff like that. It's a podcast that's like produced by Democracy at Work, and so I'm fairly familiar both with Rick and the whole team at Democracy at Work, which are amazing people. And I've had, I have I think 2 or 3 episodes with Rick on my podcast, and I've seen a lot of Rick's videos and stuff like that. And there's a kind of a cadence, a way of speaking. There's a rhetorical flavor that Rick uses that is kind of not always conducive for the crowd of people who are watching Destiny, because I know, like, okay, so
Yeah.
Destiny talks really fast and people watch Destiny on 2x. So like these people are just people who like want rapid fire stuff, rapid fire conversations that's just like back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And Rick
Yeah.
Wolf's style is very much like the joke, the joke basically, we have to go back to feudalism. And he's done, even on my podcast, I remember I had 6 questions I wanted to ask him, and I got to ask 2 because the podcast went for an hour and a half because we got on two questions, because there is this like long storytelling that he does that if you listen to the story, it's compelling. But if you want to have a back and forth, or couching it as a debate, it's really frustrating to see it kind of devolve into lecturing on one side and then on the other side finding a like thing to nitpick about and focus on that as a way of eating away at the kind of like style. And that was what encouraged me to just kind of say like, wow, like I've seen a few Destiny things and I've seen enough Vosh to kind of know what's going on, but I don't really want to wade into the waters too much. Like, this is what I was thinking. So I just like found a way to contact Destiny, and I just said, hey, like, I do have this connection. I think I could do a little bit better job, and would you be interested? And like, to his credit, he was like, sure. And so, yeah, it was, for me, it was just kind of an opportunity. The thing about what you were saying too is like, you have 60 seconds. Like, I even listened back to that conversation. It was like, I'm talking a lot. I'm like using a lot of time. I mean, it was a pretty long conversation, but like, I do think that was kind of necessary. I feel like in some ways you can do it in a way that doesn't bore people, but that connects enough things that are relevant to people's lives, that then using that much time doesn't feel like a lecture. It feels like worth listening to, which is why I think, like, maybe it was because he was just playing the game and he wasn't really paying attention, but he didn't interrupt me that much. He didn't really, I mean, a few times he said like, yeah, I'm pretty sure I could argue for this same thing. And that for me is just sort of like, well, where does all the misunderstanding with like lefties and stuff come from? And that was partly just trying to like give an example to people who aren't used to seeing it, of somebody who might take what might seem like radical positions, but can explain it in a way that isn't crazy. It isn't like, it doesn't seem wild. And I feel like I got the opportunity to do that in that conversation with Destiny. And it was so funny. I did look through the comments on the YouTube, and it was like not bad. It didn't, like, a lot of the comments on that video were just like, that's a good conversation. Like, I wonder, like, it seemed fine. And so I don't know if that's good for Destiny. Like, I think that there is a kind of utility in the inflammatory, and our conversation was definitely not that. And so it depends on the audience for that. And so that's what I'm thinking. Like, a few people have contacted me, including you, after that conversation, and it must mean that you're the kind of person who is both willing to sit down for a 3-hour conversation, but also isn't necessarily bored or frustrated by long explanations of things, so long as those things connect and are not done in a like a lecture kind of style, but in a style that people are familiar with, which is kind of like podcasting, just kind of talking about what you know, not necessarily like super academically. So I guess that was long-winded as well.
No, it was fine. I would say that you did actually a really good job in that discussion with Destiny. And the reason I'll give you some reasons why. One of the reasons is that you up front stated your position and then spent time elaborating. And I love that. Like, I love it when someone says, "Well, this is my position," and they're succinct and concise. And then as they're giving their definition, you're thinking, "Oh, well, what about this exception? What about that exception?" And then that's where your elaboration comes from. I think that was the stumbling block for a lot of people who are not on the political left, who are listening to Richard Wolff for the first time. And that wasn't the first time I've listened to him. I've watched quite a few of his lectures. So I knew what his style was going to be, and I was worried for him going into this debate that he was going to not be able to make the switch to a debating style, and instead would fall back on his honed university lecturer rhetoric. Right.
Yeah.
So basically, you gave a concise definition up front, which is exactly what you should do in a debate discussion, and then you elaborated on it, and that's perfectly fine. Like, I think that's totally what people should do. And so I thought you did really well. I thought you carried the conversation really well. I did notice that Destiny was slightly more passive than normal. I think that I have a suspicion that just may be a reflection of your calm demeanor, honestly. Like, if you go berserk at Destiny, he comes back at you berserk.
Sure.
He's kind of a bit like a mirror.
Yeah.
He emulates the people that he's talking to, which is interesting, right?
Yeah.
I'm just gonna cough for 2 seconds.
Sure.
Oh, sorry. I tried to mute myself. I
It's
missed
all
the
good.
button. Wow, sorry. But yeah, no. It's also interesting that Destiny has evolved his style and his rhetoric over time as well, and he's become less of an angry gamer personality and more of a willing to discuss with equal sort of terms and just be calm about it as well.
Yeah, I saw him describe it as this idea that he was in some ways pulling people back from the alt-right, and there's been this switch in terms of his perspective where he does feel like he has now have to pull people back from the far left, and so he kind of is playing that he's trying to bring everybody back to pretty mainstream liberalism, which more power to him. Like, I think that's it becomes a more difficult position to defend. I think the deeper you go into some of the structures in terms of the basic ideas that inform it and justify it, which I think did come out a little bit in the Rick Wolff debate, but not in a way that was really helpful for like understanding some of what might be the flaws in that kind of thinking. And like, I didn't really do that as much, I guess, when I was talking to Destiny. I think for me, it was just like a lot of trying to explain how stuff fits together. And because I don't think a lot of people even think about that or find that really interesting. But like for me, I mean, I went to law school and I care about like how things are going to work and have thought a lot about how things could work and have, tried to put that all together in a way that like can still connect with what might seem like a more radical tradition, but might be actually encapsulated in ideas that are very digestible and very easy to understand, so long as you don't do them in some kind of style that alienates. Because I've done that a lot. I mean, I think before I started essentially the podcast, there's a lot of debating online via Facebook and things like that, but not really interested in having bombastic conversations because they don't usually produce much light. They just produce a lot of heat. And I think it's much easier to calmly approach subjects, listen to people, to what they have to say, and if you have oppositions, to calmly state the oppositions. And I think it tends to disarm otherwise very armed people, which Destiny can be. And so, yeah, I just think it's the right way to go. There's no need to get super upset. I'd rather understand the way that you think about whatever, so that we can be better prepared to approach those positions when we hear them in the future in a way that doesn't like cause people to get offended or frustrated, but may actually provoke them to think about the things that they think or believe or want to endorse. So, yeah.
Yeah, quite right.
So I'm curious, like when you emailed me, you said you described yourself as a centrist, and I'm curious, maybe as a kind of same thing, like you were talking about a kind of definition of, you know, how would you define, I guess, where you're coming from?
I think the current left right wing axis that we use to describe political spectrum in conversations is kind of awful.
Mhm.
It lacks a lot of explanatory power in my mind.
Right.
I consider myself a centrist because I have some positions that I hold that would be considered right wing, and then I hold some positions. I have some positions that I hold that would be considered left wing. So what do I mean by that? Well, one example would be that I'm pro gun right. Right. So in America, that's the Second Amendment. I think the right to bear and have arms. I think that's essential to freedom. But so that's one position I hold. On the left side of the spectrum, I'm Australian, so I grew up in a system where we have a universal healthcare system, and I can see the good in that. That I don't I don't think you should be bankrupted because your child has a heart condition that needs surgery. Like that just seems. I don't know if that's the sort of thing that happens in the United States. Maybe I'm
It
being
does.
hyperbolic or something.
No, it does.
But yeah, that's crazy. Oh my god, that's so there's so many levels of crazy.
I've made the decision not to go to the doctor because I knew I couldn't afford it.
So, yeah, see, that's crazy.
Yeah.
Right. That doesn't actually help society. That hurts society because now you're treating a bigger problem at the end of the day instead of just getting the help you need when you need it. Right.
Yeah.
So I have some positions on the right, and I have some positions on the left. I was raised in a conservative household, so some of my family members you would consider I don't know, right wing is the right word. I'd say conservative. I think this marriage between conservatism and the right wing is there's very much an Americo-central sort of Americanism to that. In a lot of other countries, you don't have to be right wing if you're conservative. You could be left wing. It's not as connected. I think I think it's kind of an indictment on the two-party system, which I don't think is very helpful, because you have these people who are slightly right of center, and then you have people who are alt-right in the same party, and then you have people who are slightly left of center, and what's the word, progressives in the same party. That's not very, like, I think that's kind of awful in a lot of ways. I think the political system in New Zealand is much better, mixed party proportional, I think it's called, where every government is a coalition government,
right,
and parties rise and fall on a regular basis, right? So as long as you get, I think it's 2% of the national vote, you get at least a couple of
members of
MPs.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so every government most governments are a coalition, right? And so it's so much easier to vote for what you believe along, as in ideological political lines, because it's not just the same two parties every time.
Yeah, and it's also,
I think that,
it's also how you can team up against you can team up with even people who you significantly oppose to get rid of someone who sucks even more, which is just what happened in Israel.
Correct. Yes, you can. You can team up with someone you might not normally team up with in order to drive through, whatever is the most common hot topic of the day.
But you can also have Golden Dawn sitting in the Greek Parliament too. So it, it
yes, you do.
ways.
But I mean, yeah. But if you don't have, but you want those people to be. In my mind, you want those people to be represented.
Yeah.
Because it's when they go into the shadows that it's really a problem.
That's
that's
my argument against sort of cancel culture, or at least this this general disposition towards not allowing people, even with very problematic and sort of horrible views, to not express those views in public, because that's an expression valve, that's a release valve that allows them the ability to say those kinds of things and then to deal with the social consequences thereof. But you get to a point where it's sort of like not even allowed at all. There's no space for which that can happen. Like you do need protected space for those kinds of things to happen. And like the freedom of speech or something like that is only as good as the worst kind of speech. And as soon as you start cracking down on that, social or political, you're entering into significantly problematic zones.
No, I agree. I think I think it's Noam Chomsky that said this. You're either for the speech of people you hate, or you're not for free speech. And I think he said that, and if he did, then I completely agree with it. You need that stuff out in the open. You need people to try. You need to be in a position where people aren't regularly self-censoring themselves.
Yeah.
Like a level of self-censoring is good, right? Because you want to be able to get along with the people that you're around. And if you just say whatever the hell comes to your mind, that's not going to happen, because we have a tendency of thinking, reacting in a certain way, and we need like a traffic cop in our mind. This thought, can I speak this out? Maybe you shouldn't. Maybe that it's not a good idea. And you want a level of that, but you don't want it so much that people feel oppressed, because when people feel oppressed, they start acting out in ways that you don't need. So yeah, I agree. I'm all for free speech.
There is a kind of legal trope in some ways from a Supreme Court case where sunlight is the best disinfectant. That the best way to counteract really bad ideas is to encounter them, and to even have that moment like, holy shit, really, you think that way? Like, you're crazy wrong. I do think that that's like in some ways coming back to the destiny thing, is like what the value there is like you're listening to people who are fucking crazy. You're like, okay, like these people really exist, and it's good to see the ability to counteract those ideas in real time. And I think that's what a lot of the value kind of is, and that's cool to provide that kind of value. It's not in some ways always what I'm looking for. I would be willing to talk to anybody, So like, I think there's a certain kind of crowd who would even be on the left who would get an email from somebody who would call themselves centrist or conservative and just ignore it. Just sort of like, well, I'm not going to talk to them. Only talk to people in my group, my perspective, or whatever. But I'm curious, when you said you can be sort of, in your view, left wing or right wing and conservative. What is it that you mean by conservative? You want to conserve what?
Oh, conservative isn't religious.
Religious Okay. Are
Yeah,
you using those interchangeably?
Yeah, I guess so. And I shouldn't be. You're quite right.
I mean,
yeah, I was raised in a religiously conservative household.
If what religion?
Christianity.
Like non-denominational Christianity or Roman Catholic?
Yeah, non-denominational Protestant.
Okay.
Christian. My parents were Catholics.
Okay,
so,
but they left the church.
They left the Catholic Church. Yeah,
after the scandals.
For whatever. Who knows? I don't know.
Okay. I mean, there's plenty of reasons to not want to be in the Catholic Church.
Well, yeah, it's funny you should say that. Like being raised in that household, I always considered my parents kind of crazy, and they are kind of crazy people. But
crazy religious beliefs, you mean?
No, just crazy in general. It's
okay.
It's a lot to get into.
Not able to critically think. You mean?
Yeah. No, just kind of crazy, but it's hard to quantify that without explaining it. But
sure.
I'm not sure I want to go that deep into it.
You could leave that to the side. That's fine.
Yeah. But certainly there was antagonism towards the Catholic Church in my household. Okay. So I was raised under that.
I see.
And for the longest possible time, I wouldn't say I was anti-Catholic so much as Catholic skeptic is the wrong word. I had an aversion towards Catholicism, or maybe there was some latent sort of bigotry there.
Okay.
And it's only in recent years that I've learned to come to appreciate Catholicism's intellectual approach with their theology.
Okay.
So one of the problems I would say with Protestantism is I don't know how to describe this. It's almost like an unwillingness to reconcile No, that's the wrong way to put it. I'm trying to be careful with my words because I'm trying
Sure.
not to offend people. But
Yeah.
um, one of the things I really like about Catholicism now that I've spent time investigating it is, and I'm not a Catholic, is that they do seem to have a rigorously intellectual approach to their theology.
Sure.
And they do seem more willing to reconcile their theology with the material world, which I appreciate. I like that.
Like evolution is Catholic dogma.
Sure. Yeah, it is. That's right.
Yeah.
Also, the
Big Bang Theory, I think, even is, if I remember.
Yeah. So in 1927, I've forgotten his name. A Catholic Belgian priest came up with the theory of the Big Bang, and then in 1929, I think it was, Edward Hubble created the mathematics that proved that it was possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Georges Lemaitre, that's right. Georges Lemaitre, he's a Belgian Catholic
Lemaitre,
priest. Came up
that's
with
right.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, 1927, I think it was.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's this.
The
There's
Catholic
there's
Observatory
higher
is
degree.
an amazing place, and yeah, there's a long tradition of like, especially with the reintroduction of Aristotle into Western culture from Arabic culture, the kind of bringing back strict logic. So then you have to like, let's construct the whole logical algorithm for Catholicism, and it's just like, okay, if this, if that, and you can go all the way down. There is, I agree, a kind of strong intellectual tradition that even in some ways survived and benefited from the Enlightenment, which not a lot of religions did.
Yeah.
I think a lot of religions suffered
Yeah.
from the Enlightenment, but Catholicism seemed to adapt and kind of use
Yes.
either the language or the actual system to maintain itself. I do think, though, that the Catholic Church is likely at least stagnated, if not declined, in terms of its both influence and adherence.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that people are less willing to put themselves in general under a strictly hierarchical system.
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting when having a discussion with atheists about the state of belief in the world, because it looks to me like the total number of believers in something spiritual or something other than just materialism hasn't changed, but the total number of people who are willing to say they subscribe to a particular traditional religion has decreased.
Yeah.
So what I'm seeing is an increase I'm seeing a maintenance in the level of spirituality in the world.
Yep.
But a decrease in the adherence to traditional structured hierarchical religions.
If you looked at a graph of the decrease in the participation rate in organized religion and the increased rate of self-help and meditation, I bet they would be perfectly inverse. So
yeah, I wouldn't want to make that bet because you're probably right. Yeah.
I think that a lot of people in the history of like human history in some ways but specifically like organized religion attached to civilizations, let's say. So we're like post-agricultural revolution religions, right? These like systems that long endure and are multi-generational and are means of communicating all kinds of like real and metaphorical truths couched in mythical stories that everyone can kind of remember and cohese around. I think the majority of people who participated in that were just getting good vibes from it. It kind of made things make sense. They didn't really do a lot of deep thinking about it or anything like that. They were really just kind of, yeah, that sounds like a good explanation. And, most human beings would prefer an incorrect explanation to no explanation at all. So when you ask somebody, holy shit, what's that bright light in the sky when it's raining? Somebody says, well, that's God showing you how you got to be careful and you got to make sure that you survive or something like that. There's some kind of story that you're like, okay, well, that sounds good enough. And then like, I just stay away from lightning. And so I think there's a lot of people who it's fairly easy to leave an organized religion, which is where they would get a lot of this kind of like good feelings and just like, catharsis and social connection and all that kind of stuff. and they are getting it from social groups, even on social media, maybe on Instagram, and then also like their friends and ski groups and self-help conversations and stuff like that. And so I think uh, uh, religion has served that role for most people. But I think for me, the frustrating bit, only both from my own personal experience and I think generally accepted amongst a lot of people, so one of the reasons you see a lot of atheists is that there's this significantly detrimental effect to taking a deep dive sometimes into religious ideas, because it's very, especially when you're young, because it's very scary and very um it causes a kind of existential crisis in terms of how you understand yourself and what you're doing and all these thoughts that come into your head, especially when you're like going through or just finished with puberty and all these kind of things. I mean, I think there can be significantly damaging effects to the way that organized religion takes a spiritual impulse that we all have and puts it in the framework it does, which involves a lot of really hard subjects, up to including death and sacrifice and then weird stories when you really do read the Bible about like God telling people to go kill people and all this kind of stuff. And it's like it really just doesn't comport in some ways. Like you are having these transcendental and very human spiritual experiences. And then when you tell somebody about that, they're like, you should talk to the priest or pastor about it. And you tell the priest or pastor about it. It's like, yeah, there's this story in the Bible about Job, and he had a real difficult time with God, or like, but it really all just like worked out at the end. Or like Abraham was supposed to sacrifice his fucking son, but then like didn't have to in the end, so it's all good. Then you read all these stories, and you're like, what the fuck am I supposed to get from this? And so like maybe that's a kind of biased experience I've had, because I do know that there's also a lot of like interesting stories and moral storytelling and all these kind of things that you can get a lot of value from. But it there's a I don't know if it's really true, it might be apocryphal, but there's a story of Thomas Jefferson essentially going through the Bible and getting rid of all like the spiritual and stupid bullshit parts. And I think maybe it was just the New Testament. And you still get all these nice moral lessons about being nice to people and like not cheating other people and not stealing and not taking advantage and like just be doing right to people. And I think a lot of people just take that stuff and kind of run with it, and they can do that. You can do that in a secular way, and so you get to avoid all of the pain and frustration and weird stories and ancient traditions and all these things that don't really make sense, but you can still get the good feelings and the spiritual connection and stuff like that. I mean, you can even do hallucinogenic drugs and go to music festivals, and many of those things are the kind of transcendent experiences you get when you would go to some kind of religious ceremony where you'd have all these kind of traditions and rituals that would connect you with all other kinds of people. I mean, we're finding ways to do the same kind of acts that would give us spiritual experiences without having to thrust it into the framework of Judeo-Christian, Islamic, Hindu frameworks, which I think is probably better. I think it's better for most people. It seems to be less harmful and just as expressive. And so that's maybe a very shorthand way of why I've read a lot about religions, and I've investigated a lot and listened to a lot of people talk about it, but it's just not, it has never been convincing enough that I would be willing to take all of the frustration and damaging parts of it in order to just get the lessons I could learn other places. But I don't know how you feel about that.
I think there's a lot of elements to organized religion that are beneficial to society. One is the community aspect of it, support network, a sharing of common values, a community of belief, a sense of belonging.
Yep.
All these things you can actually find somewhere else.
Yeah,
it's possible. Organized religion provides a mechanism to package that in an easily digestible way. But what I think, for me personally, the thing that's not replaceable is an objective morality and an objective moral system.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that would really impress me And one of the things that I know would win a lot of people over, you're an atheist, right?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So one of the things that would impress me quite a lot, I don't know if it would convert me to atheism or not, but one of the things that would impress me a lot is if an atheist could create an objective moral framework from materialism. And I've seen Sam Harris attempt to do this. I think it was a good attempt. I think it was ultimately not successful. But if someone were to present, for a lot of people, I think if you could present a cogent argument or set of evidence or proof or whatever you want to call it, I'm not philosophically trained, so I'm going to get some stuff wrong.
You don't have to be.
Yeah.
That's fine.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I find it kind of pretentious, some of that stuff.
Yes.
Anyway, I think if you could actually create an objective moral framework that would actually win over a lot of people, it's the objective morality stance is one that certainly a lot of people point to towards being the reason why they hold on to their faith.
Okay.
Right. So that, yeah, I mean that's a big one. But I to digress a little bit, I actually in preparation for this discussion, I spent quite a bit of time doing research. I listened to quite a bit of socialists. I mean, I'm happy to keep talking about religion if you want to, but I mean, the primary focus was to actually try and talk to you about socialism. I did a bunch of research. I came up with a bunch of questions about socialism. Is that all right if we swap?
Yes, yeah, that's fine. I mean, I mean, where if anywhere religion becomes relevant again, the subject may come up. But yeah, I'm more than happy to
sure.
talk about. I'm curious about whatever questions or things that you have about that. I maybe it sounds not fair or something like that. I don't know what qualifies someone as an expert in something. I've read a lot of Marx. I've thought about it a lot. I've engaged in a lot of political parties. I've had a lot of discussions about people on left, right, and center. And so I have a particular perspective, but in no way would consider myself some kind of expert. But I'll tell you how I think about whatever question you want to ask me.
Yeah, it's cool. That's kind of how I think of myself as well. Like I would say I've dabbled dangerously in a lot of different subjects, and perhaps I'm not an expert in any one. It's really funny because in my preparation, I was like, how do I want to approach this? Like, this is the first time I've actually had a discussion with someone who's going to be streaming or recording a session to later post on social media. Clearly, I want to come across well. I want to be cogent. I want to be compelling.
Yep.
You want to speak well. You want to present well for your team, your tribe, whatever that may be.
Sure.
Do I go in for the hard kill? Do I try and find really hard questions, or do I just focus on trying to have a good conversation? What do I do? It's all still up in the air, quite honestly. But I came up with a bunch of questions about socialism in general.
Okay. Can I ask what you did for like preparatory research? I mean, maybe that's not fair.
Yeah, no, it's fine. I read Das Kapital.
You read the whole Das Kapital?
Yeah, it was painful. Oh my god, it was painful because he's so verbose. In fact, like I said, harkening back to this other conversation, I really like it when someone provides a concise descriptor of what it is they're positing and then spends time elaborating. Karl Marx spends all of his time elaborating. And there's nothing concise about what he says. It was really hard work. I was like, no. If I'm going to be able to do one thing at least in preparation, I didn't do just one thing, but if I'm going to do just one thing, I'm going to at least be able to go on this podcast and say, yeah, I actually read Das Kapital. I'd read the Communist Manifesto several years ago. A lot of it doesn't come to mind, but I wanted to do that as well. And the reason was one of the questions I definitely wanted to talk to you about was the labor theory of value, right? So that's certainly I wanted to try and familiarize myself with some of the concepts there.
Yeah.
So I've got about 18, who knows how many of these we'll get through. I've got like 18 discussion points on socialism.
Okay.
And then I've got about 15 questions on co-ops specifically because one of the other major ways that I prepared for this conversation was I went through and listened to a lot of your other podcasts. And that was really good, especially the one, I can't remember which number it is, but there was one where you were speaking to a school and you were giving like I wouldn't say, dumbed down is the wrong way to put it, but I can't think of a better way to put it right now. Correct. Yeah, you had an introductory sort of presentation on socialism in general, and it was really good. It was actually quite good. I liked it a lot. I think that's one maybe you should highlight on your channel or something on YouTube, whatever it is. I don't know. It was good. I thought it was quite good as a basic intro, because one of the problems with socialism and harkening back to or socialist communities in general, harkening back to something you said earlier on, is we seem to be a lot more tribal these days with our positions, and finding someone who is willing to talk to you and extrapolate on these ideas is not easy. Like can be a bit of a challenge. Getting into Vosh's server is a real pain, for example. So
unnecessarily. 18 questions. Holy shit! Let's do it.
and if you need to, if we need to stop or you got to go, you got to take care of the family. Just that's cool. We can stop anytime.
Kids in bed. It's all good.
So good. Yeah. Okay. So some of these I think are good questions. Some of these are dumb questions.
All right.
Some of these may be difficult to answer. Some of them should be pretty easy.
Are they evenly distributed? So there's like good questions with bad questions?
How do you mean?
Like, are you going to ask a really, really good opening question and then a really, really bad second question? And then like a fairly good
God knows. No. I didn't categorize them. I just wrote them as I was studying.
Gotcha.
So some of them are good, some of them are awful.
Okay.
And I'm just trying to think of a way to actually record the fact that I've actually asked that question or not, because I put the whole thing in Trello as an agile method to store them. And so I've got all these cards in Trello as an agile board.
Well, let's make sure they go from in progress to completed.
Completed, yeah, that's right, exactly.
Close out those
that's just for the. That's it. This for anyone who has no idea what we're talking about. Agile's like a programming framework for completing work, and it's actually quite productive. I like it a lot.
A modified form of that is what I would argue you would actually want in terms of the internal structure of your co-op, but we can get there.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, so I'll just read this quote first before I even ask you this question. So this quote's from John Stuart Mill, who I'm a big fan of.
Sure.
He who knows only his own side of the argument knows little of that. His reason may be good, and no one may have been able to refute them, but if he is equally unable to refute the reasons on the opposite side, if he does not so much as know what they are, he has no ground for preferring either option.
Yeah.
I would assume that you agree with this wholeheartedly, that you must know the positions of your opponents, if you will.
And you'd have to know what would have to be true to convince you that you're wrong. Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yep.
To that end, first question, who do you listen to on the right side of the political spectrum? Like, who are some of the people that you listen to on the right-hand side of the political spectrum?
I think, let me see. I have listened to a fair amount of Lauren Southern, Andy, I don't know how you say his last name. In terms of like super right wing, there's a lot of I guess PragerU would be videos that I've seen in terms of it reflecting, I think, traditional right-wing values. To be honest with you, many of the right-wing perspectives that I hear and encounter are in conversations with people, or in the terms of a debate between a more right-wing perspective or a left-wing perspective. I've looked at Breitbart and Daily Caller in terms of trying to get that kind of media. My YouTube algorithm seems to get messed up in terms of if I've watched a Tucker Carlson clip or something like that to be able to see what that kind of perspective is. I've watched a fair amount of, I would say, Fox News talking heads, I think, but unfortunately, like to me, and I think what confuses the algorithm is like obviously Chris Wallace to me presents a kind of fair and not sort of ridiculous right-wing view. I have, in order to understand my parents a little bit, listened before we can no longer do that to Rush Limbaugh, and I do in my car have the local right-wing AM radio station tuned into my favorites, and so they play. God, I can't even remember the fucking personalities' names, but I could hear their voices because I don't necessarily turn in all the time, and I hate commercials, and so as soon as there's a commercial, I rage quit on a radio station, which obviously happens quite a bit. But so yeah, that I guess is a summation of the different voices. Obviously, Ben Shapiro and more. I mean, even I think Dave Rubin has sufficiently gone to from a maybe this classical liberal angle, you might say, but I wouldn't engage in. I don't engage in a lot of left wing streaming really, and I don't engage in a lot of right wing streaming. So not any of the kind of streaming platforms, but more traditional kinds of right-wing media sources and right-wing personalities, I would say, that are trying to express those views.
Yeah, sure. Do you have a favorite? Is there someone that you actually... One of the things I noticed when I was doing research was I found some people easy to listen to on the political left, but I found some people really difficult to listen to.
Yeah.
So it's really difficult to listen to. It just comes off. I just can't even explain why it's so frustrating, but it is.
Who did you say?
Vosh.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But then there are other people on the left who are progressives that I don't mind listening to at all. Jimmy Dore, I especially love. Like he's amazing.
Yeah.
His honesty is incredible. His willingness to take pot shots at his own team that's so much. I personally find so much I think he has a lot of integrity to do that. Like it takes a lot of strength of character to be able to take really critical look at your own side and say, no, I'm not happy about this. I'm going to actually talk about it, even if I lose some allies.
Conveniently for him, it also is I would say financially and socially beneficial to do so. He's found a really good niche that there's enough of us who are like, yep, dude, we totally get what you're saying. Like, more power to you.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, it does. But then when the whole world is your stage, potentially, thanks to the internet, you can find a niche for anything, really.
Sure.
So, yeah, no, I agree. I like him. But
you asked if
one
I have
of
a
the
favorite. I honestly don't know if I have a favorite. I mean, I don't really get like
maybe a favorite's the wrong way to
most
conceptualize it. Maybe, or just someone you enjoy listening to
on the right wing.
Someone who on the right wing or center, or just someone, or maybe someone who's religious. I don't know.
I mean, it might sound self-serving, but I honestly don't enjoy listening to what I would consider ideological pontification. Like, I will listen to it because I think it's important to be informed, but very little of it I enjoy. There's oh fuck, what's the name of it? It's on British radio. It's a guy who often hosts conversation between religious and non-religious people. Religiously speaking, what the hell is it? Anyway, there's one where obviously you're having traditional debates. I've listened to a lot of obviously like Matt Dillahunty debating, a religious person, William Lane Craig. I was for a long time very much like engaged in the 2007, 2008, 2009 new atheist kind of movement, and was very much a fan of Hitch, though I disagreed with him. I would have agreed with Hitch in 1991. I disagreed with Hitch in 2009, and but I enjoyed his take on religion, and read the books and really, I mean, I devoured a lot of Christopher Hitchens, videos and writings, and I've probably read everything that
He was very
Christopher
good.
wrote.
He always spoke well. Christopher
Yeah,
Hitchens.
and wrote better, which is a real testament to him. And so I've listened to a lot of conversations, I think, that are essentially the kind of debate style of presenting the different kinds of arguments, especially in more traditional kinds of ways. So there's lots of Soho debates and Monk debates and Intelligence Squared debates and those kind of things as a kind of way of getting a quick perspective on how people argue and present these different kind of perspectives. And a lot of those are from, religious presuppositionalism to whether or not the Soviet Union was state capitalist or socialist. I mean, I'll listen to a conversation of two different sides, so long as it isn't acrimonious to listen to, about damn near everything. And so I think for me, that's a lot of how I've at least gotten introduced to it, and in some ways what I enjoy listening to. I mean, I enjoy listening to not one side spout off, but to listen to kind of exchange of ideas. That's what's interesting to me.
Yeah, definitely. I always appreciated Peter Hitchens more than Christopher Hitchens, though, just to be honest. Of course.
I mean, I think if you want to have somebody who is probably one of the better people at making the points, sure, Peter Hitchens.
For sure.
Will be a person that I would say, it can hold his own in a religious debate against his albeit dying brother. So
yeah, that's right. Yeah. Probably my favorite atheist is probably Cosmic Skeptic.
Sure.
He's amazing.
Yeah.
He's just amazing. He's just he's amazing to listen to. He's remarkably focused on being fair to both sides of a debate, and he wants to really present a steel man of the opponent's position as much as he possibly can. I think for that's very commendable.
Rationality Rules is
someone,
a good example of a person who can do that.
Yeah, I'm not as much of a fan.
Yeah. It's a different style.
Yeah, it's a different style. I think he needs to spend, I think his name's Stephen, he needs to spend more time talking to conservatives and religious people, I think.
I think he also needs more time talking to leftists, too.
Yeah.
Not just religious people. So, Kyle Kalinske, secular talk. I think that his trajectory is exactly where a lot of people who start when you talk about religion stuff and move into political stuff. I mean, I think Kyle Kalinske's career is exactly how it should go in some ways. I think that you can start talking these like big kind of religious things, but oftentimes I do feel that if you explore it long enough, and even you've said this in some ways, there's this political angle to it, and it becomes politicized and a kind of political football. And I think you can easily take the training you have in terms of logical thinking and investigating arguments and all this kind of stuff, and you can apply it in a political lens and have a good perspective where your show is called Secular Talk, but you never talk about religion. You're only talking about politics. I think that Rationality Rules and even Cosmic Skeptic would be, very positively oriented to begin discussing political issues in the same kind of honest, fair, steel manning sort of way. And I think one example of somebody who can do that very well is Anthony Magnabosco, I think is his name, who does street epistemology, just asking people what they think, a strongly held belief, and then interrogating a little, like very nicely, but interrogating the basis of that belief, the strength of that belief on what epistemological grounds they rest on. And you can talk to anybody about any position they have in that way, whether it's religious or not. And I think he's a lot of times had religious discussions, but he's now encountering a lot more, especially talking to college students, of kind of political perspectives that may or may not be hard to justify or potentially problematic. And so, in terms of some of the things that I have encountered and have enjoyed listening to, conversations like that are well worth watching. Street epistemology, gonna give it a like and a subscribe because it's good.
And just to round out that conversation, I would say one of my favorite people on the right would be probably Michael Malice. I don't know if you're familiar with his work, but
Michael Malice.
Michael Malice. He's amazing. Oh, I love him. He's incredible. I often disagree with him, but I find it endlessly entertaining to listen to him. And
Oh
he,
yeah. I know this guy. I know
he's
him.
the
Sure.
guy's, yeah, he focuses on North Korea a lot,
Yes.
but he's an anarchist. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Yep. I've seen some. Yeah. Another person for whom I will listen to and go, yep, and then have that one point where we're like, well, there's where we diverge, you know. And I often
Yes,
just
right,
I would
exactly.
just couch that in some ways. You might call it ideology, but in some ways, to me, it's values. That at some point there's going to be this alignment of values and then a distinction of values that sends you in two different perspectives. That's what I mean.
Yeah.
Even if I would call myself a Marxist or a communist, I have a lot of similarities with anarchists, even sort of left and right anarchists. I have a lot of suspicions of the state and all those kind of things, and we can speak a lot of the same languages. And the question is, where do you want to put your faith in the absence of the kind of state that we're normally used to? Do you want to put it in the hands of a hierarchically, in my view, oppressive elite, or do you want to put it in the hands of the people who can decide how to do it in the kind of fairest, in my view, most democratic process you can? And that is oftentimes where we diverge. Where I don't want to maintain private ownership of things in order to maintain a certain set of individuals having a kind of privilege that the rest of us don't have. And so that's the one of the divergent values, like with anarcho-capitalist, let's say. But I mean, when I was 15, I would have called myself an anarcho-capitalist. I think that I thought that the market and general structure of, like, you know, employers and employees would be sufficient and would work just fine without a lot of government intrusion. I think through the course of my life, I've realized that the actual government intrusion we do have in the quote unquote free market is usually because of market failures, in the sense that the free market actually can't do it. And so the state either has to or does step in to stabilize the system long enough for it to limp on. And capitalism has lasted way longer than it probably should have, usually because it has aligned itself with the state in a minor way, in a place that doesn't have a strong welfare state like the United States, in a little bit stronger way in the ones that have like a welfare state, and then in a very strong way in fascist and I don't know, Bolshevist. I don't know what you want to call the Soviet Union, but this quote unquote communist systems. And so,
Yep.
you know, you like, I can understand frustrations with the state and weirdness about the state, but I don't think the market is the solution to the state. I think state intrusion is because the market is not very the quote unquote free market. A regulated market, I think, would be just fine. But free markets tend to have way more perverse incentives than you want and produce consequences that you don't want to deal with, and that you find a mechanism to intrude on in when it's failing so that it doesn't fuck everything up. And I think that's the role of kind of bourgeois government, to maintain the capitalist system, and if it has to constrain it, it will. And I think that's where we exist. And if it needs to take it over in order to, you know, rapidly industrialize, let's say, then it'll do that too. And that's the experience of Russia and China. You know, the state has an interest, and it's interested in maintaining the interest of the ruling class, or at least the dominant ruling class, even in the world. And in our sense, at least, the mid 1800s, it's been the capitalist class. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've been talking for about an hour now,
Yeah.
and we haven't yet gotten to the meat of the
Okay. I'll try to go
conversation.
faster.
No. It wasn't a criticism. I was just, I wanted to try and keep
maybe
it
a multi-part
entertaining for your.
conversation.
Yeah, it may end up being.
Yeah.
I'd be happy to return. Before we, just 2 seconds. Before we progress with some of the harder questions I've got for you, I just need to just clarify, would you consider yourself a consequentialist or a deontologist?
If I had to pick between the two, probably a deontologist, but I probably wouldn't pick either.
Oh, what sort of ethical framework would you use to make moral choices?
The closest I would say would be a kind of biology influenced approach to a kind of virtue ethics. So what I
Okay.
mean by that is, I think that human beings have an evolutionary history. We are apes, and we have evolved with all of the characteristics of mammals and apes of a particular area and all this kind of stuff. We've obviously gone out in different places of the world and created different cultures and different frameworks in which to express, I think, some basic fundamental commonalities in our approach to something approaching fairness, or mutuality and solidarity. It's these kind of values or drives that have allowed us to create civilizations and express the true capacity of humanity in terms of like going to the fucking moon and all this kind of stuff. And so for me, there, like, the reason I would say would pick deontology over consequentialism in terms of having to pick between the two is that for me, I actually take the view that the best we can do is Kant's hypothetical imperative. So not the categorical, but the hypothetical. I don't think there's a categorical imperative. I think it's always hypothetical. So all moral discussions have to posit as a first stance the axiomatic position on which moral reasoning is based. It's often there where we have our disagreements, where we have not been able to universalize a kind of general agreement on morality, on what morality even is. It's why it's like one of the last remaining genuine philosophical questions. For me, it's because it is always hypothetical. It's always going to be predicated on a base axiomatic position. Sam Harris is obviously is the well-being of conscious creatures. I think that's often what we're really talking about. Flourishing was the kind of perspective of Aristotle, and I think that that's kind of this attempt to encapsulate the divergent urges of humanity, including all of our sexual, social, exploratory, hierarchical, like all of these different expressions find themselves in what we would ultimately call a moral system. And I think so. When you were talking about the issue of religion and objective morality, I wanted to ask what you meant by objective, because for me, if what I mean by objective, I think you could make a claim that this is an objective moral position in the sense that it applies to all human beings. All human beings have a history, an evolutionary heritage that's built into our DNA. It causes us to have certain kinds of linguistic, social, cultural, logical abilities and positions that allow us to essentially lay down flags at certain places and red lines and different things. And that is often usually it's context dependent. It is, like I said with Destiny a few times, historically, socially, culturally, economically contingent on where a person finds themselves. But there are these commonalities in terms of a basic kind of notion of fairness, that there is underwriting it all, a kind of general disposition towards finding some level of justification for the social and cultural systems that we see. And often our moral systems are this kind of justification for the hierarchies that we see. And so that's objective in the sense that it always happens and all human beings do it. And it is informed by our, existence and our sense perception and our desire to avoid painful and frustration and these kind of easily identifiable negative things, and want to promote these, usually positive kind of things, we might put in air quotes, but we can also create these stories in which negativity leads to positivity. And so we can create out of that this, what I would say, a sort of evolutionary biology informed virtue ethic that attempts to combine the desire to do the best that we can for all the people that we can, and to do so in a way that expresses our interests and abilities and capacities and propensities in a way that would ultimately lead to, in the consequentialist perspective, better consequences. And so you can tie all of these positions, not necessarily deontological. I just don't think there's a justification for some kind of categorical imperative. So I'll plant the flag for me on the hypothetical imperative informed by historical, social, cultural, economic contingent systems that tend to express a genuine human and even ape, ape capacity towards genuine understandings of fairness and in many ways solidarity. And I think that's as universal as I can get in a moral system. But I think it's ultimately a kind of defensible one. The problem with it is that it doesn't always lead directly to easily identifiable answers to difficult moral questions. But what it does do is inform those in a way that doesn't like prescribe a situation that might lead to, which is often the objection to a lot of moral theories, these kind of horrible consequences, the horrible like decisions, I can't remember what they're called, the uneasy paradox or something like that, where you can't lie to the Nazis at your door when you have Jews upstairs, in deontological, or that you would, if you really had to make the choice, kill 1,000 people to save 999. You have these kind of like obviously problematic decisions based on consequentialism or deontology that is in some ways surreptitiously avoided in a kind of virtue ethics. But I think that that's the best that we can do. It's probably the best that we have done, and it needs to be thrust into the 21st century. But there's a lot of Aristotelian virtue ethics, particularly, that I think is valuable and avoids the problems of 18th century and 19th century German and British approaches to morality. So yeah, that's, I guess, an answer to which one I'd choose.
Yeah, it makes sense. The only reason I asked that question is because it influences how you think about the concepts of fairness and justice and how far you may be willing to go to implement a framework that you think is morally justifiable.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
So I think this is one of the main criticisms of communist Russia,
that the
would
ends
be
justify the
this,
means.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it just, yeah, it like from that. Well, we have an obvious example of the failing of that particular moral framework. When I say when I say objectivism is an Ayn Rand thing, but moral realism or moral objectivism, what I mean by that is a moral framework external to human understanding. So it's something that had to be divinely inspired, right? So
yeah,
your traditional religiously driven monotheistic Abrahamic religion.
Yeah. The
thing.
problem I see with that is that in order to posit even the existence of an objective system, you'd have to also accept superhuman, supernatural, or divine. And so
yeah, of course.
Yeah. So like the only way that you can have a conversation, you get, if someone doesn't think that there are those things, the supernatural, the divine, or whatever, then you kind of get a 2-for-1 in the sense that you can say, well, then you don't also have any basis for an objective morality.
Well, I mean, yes, I think that would be a fair criticism.
Yeah. Okay.
But people who are on the other side of the fence wouldn't think so.
Yeah.
Of course.
Or they might ask why an objective morality is necessary.
Yeah, but then you would just counter that by saying, well, if nothing's objective, if there is no objective moral values and duties, and nothing is objective at all. Everything's subjective. If everything's subjective, then we don't have anything that has meaning. So this is the descent of Nietzsche's nihilism, right? So that the loss of the God, the loss of the hierarchy, equates to a world of meaninglessness. And for many people, that's too much to bear. Some people need or want or desire this really strong position on what is right and wrong, and not necessarily in a list of rules to adhere to sort of way, but just in the knowledge that there are things that are always right and some things that are always wrong. The strength of that is that it is in some ways more simple than having to compare every situation with every surrounding and every contributing factor to that situation. Yeah, no, that's good. It's interesting. I was worried you were going to say virtue ethics. I'm not going to lie, because it makes it really difficult unless you go to the extent of explaining your virtue ethics system over the next 2 hours. It makes it really hard to know how you will respond to any one particular point.
Okay.
Makes it really hard.
Sure.
But that's fine. I'll just live with it. You know?
Yeah.
It'll make it spicy.
This is partially the consequence of either getting familiar with, getting used to, or actually adopting a dialectical approach. For me, that's not a problem. I don't want a stringent, universalizable system that applies in all situations at all times, because situations are context dependent and they have to be seen that way. And so there's a desire to like, especially as a kind of Anglo-American, there's always this kind of desire for these kinds of systematic and universalizable perspectives that and they are, in my view, both sort of impossible, but also not all that useful. And there's an entire tradition in both continental Europe and in other places of the world to have a much more context-dependent approach to something like morality, or most systems. And I think that's partially coming out of Aristotle and then lost in some ways in Plato, and then revived by Hegel and other both sort of phenomenology-based thinkers, and also eventually existentialism, which I think is kind of where the Nietzschean aspect of that. And it's sort of funny because I think I would never call Nietzsche a nihilist. I spent like a year reading everything that Nietzsche wrote because I just fucking loved it. And there's the whole book Beyond Good and Evil. The idea, if you can actually get it out of the way that he writes, which is kind of crazy, is this whole notion of good and bad in this objective sense is what has shackled humanity from expressing other aspects of what it is to be a human. And it's really, in some ways, a lot of times perverted the capacities and the genuine sort of abilities and perspectives of people to find its expression in the world. And it reminds me of that, Stephen Jay Gould quote that, like, I'm less interested in the contortions and convulsions of Einstein's brain, but more in the fact that many like it spent their lives in a rice paddy or a sweatshop. And I think that's, there's these kind of structures, these kinds of desires for universalizability and bureaucratization in some ways are fetters to human full expression and what we might call flourishing. And so bringing it back to the kind of virtue ethics, I think that Nietzsche would probably ascribe even to a kind of virtue ethics, which is devoid of these attempts at objective good and bad, and would maybe rest on some kind of hypotheticals that you could justify in some way. And like that's the approach I'm taking, in the sense to quote unquote objectify it by saying, look, it seems to be a pretty universal human value to seek fairness and sort of what we might call justice. Those two things are very much aligned, and that is very often the basis of what we call a moral system. But that's often perverted by other structures that we create, namely our class dynamics, that alter these basic notions of fairness in order to justify obviously unfair social and cultural structures. So,
So,
yeah.
so the interesting word that you used there, and not to detract from what you were talking about, but the interesting word that you used there was shackled, right?
Yeah.
So I agree with you that once unconstrained by an objective moral framework, you can start to explore the edges of the moral system in a context that maybe wasn't conceptually possible.
Yeah.
But your opponent on the debate of the moral landscape would posit this. They would say something like, if life is a storm and you're a ship in the storm, then your objective moral framework serves as an anchor to stop you from being blown up against the rocks, which are dangerous. And as soon as you pull up anchor, you get tossed and turned and thrown about in any direction, not necessarily one of your own choosing. And ultimately, it leads to your destruction. So that would just be the counter, right?
Yeah.
That would be the opposing argument on that side.
What I would say is, using the analogy, the problem is that we are in the ocean and we're not near the coast. We're in miles deep ocean. So when we throw down an anchor, our anchor either needs to be so long that it can account for the depth of the ocean that we're in, or it's going to be so short that what it ultimately does is not ground us somewhere, but pulls us under.
Interesting.
It's a
I like the way
ocean.
you. I like the way you turned that analogy on its head.
But it is topsy turvy. It's very much, you can't predict the next wave. But if the boat has a basis for floating, then hopefully it will be able to encounter the wave. And I think sometimes, in some ways, it doesn't. And what seem like objective moral frameworks that have existed in the course of human history break down and are sort of succumbed by and overcome by other attempts to posit, these quote unquote objective moral systems. And what we find is that we often have to throw the anchor down in an attempt to ground us in this wild sea, and have to cut the fucking cord because it's bringing us all down. And sometimes our ship does sink. And I think that human evolution, especially sort of post the development of civilizations and kind of class-based structures, is really one of an experiment, a long and numerous set of experiments in how we can organize and justify an organization to achieve great things. And sometimes the quote unquote moral framework we're using, the great thing we want to create, is like a good society for everybody. That's happened, but it's been hard. And some of them are that we create national prestige for the king or czar, and they do that too. And there's always a moral system that can justify that, and always something that looks like an objective moral reality, that if you placed a person who lived now back then and those people expressed that objective moral system, the person now will go, what the fuck are you talking about? Because it doesn't align at all with the basic kind of expressions of these notions of fairness and equanimity and mutuality and solidarity, that it would seem like another, it would, it's like going to another planet on Star Trek. I'm just like, what? Like, that's why Star Trek is so cool, because it gives you all these like little thought experiments about what would it be like if I landed on a planet where like everybody ate each other when they were 50. You're like, oh my God, like that's a weird system, but like for them it's completely normal, And I think it's just a sort of science fiction way of thinking about all of the different ways that human beings have organize themselves and the systems that they use and that they always use. There's always a moral system to express basic human impulses. And I think sometimes positive human impulses. I've focused on the solidarity and mutuality and fairness, but there's also competition, and I think there's an inherent
Yeah, that's right.
there's an inherent tribal push and things like that. And so that's the benefit of something like the expanding circle idea, that we're pretty tribal, and so we can constrain our tribalism to like our fucking nuclear family, or we can expand it to our city, or we can expand it to our state or country, or Western values and cultures, or we could just say the whole world, or hell, even all conscious creatures, so we stop eating them and stuff like that. Like, we can expand our tribal quote unquote circle pretty far. And so there are ways that we can even take what seem like sometimes negative impulses and orient those towards advancing some of the other values that we also express, like the desire to flourish and to be free and to be able to and to be self-directing and autonomous, and some of these values that do feed into deontological and even consequential ideas.
Sure.
Like, in how do you evaluate the consequences of something unless you're going to say it's based on either happiness or well-being or something like that? Again, like consequentialism is a hypothetical imperative in my view. But I'm bouncing around.
Yeah, no. I think everyone has what seems to be a generalized sense of the definition of good, right? So it's this thing where it's like, it's a desirable outcome. It's a thing that provides benefit to people.
Yeah.
It's a thing that provides life. It's a thing that makes people happy.
Yeah.
But any one of those individual descriptors for the term good, when you're trying to define good in a moral system, is problematic, right? Because what if my sense of joy comes by torturing little animals, right?
Yeah.
So it's really, in philosophical terms, it's really difficult to define this concept of good, but it's something that we all seem to innately have and seem to be able to communicate at least effectively enough that we can actually have an intelligent conversation about it.
Yep. And we can create structures that enforce it and allow it to change. That we do. This is a genuine human impulse that we have found thousands upon thousands of different ways to express, and we're still trying to find one that, that has at least as little contradictions within it as possible. But I think, again, from this dialectical approach, everything is going to have contradictions within it. There's nothing that's perfect, and so even the greatest moral system we could ever create is going to have some kind of problem, and there'll be something that exploits that problem and brings about a kind of conflict where we have to resolve it and come up with something else, but that it will have its own problems, and we go in this kind of endless circle. There's no end to history or the movement of the universe, except for maybe the fucking endless expanse it'll move into at some point. But I mean, in terms of human experience of time and space, it's gonna be understood through a particular prism, and that prism is going to be contingent, but there's barriers to that prism. There's a kind of Overton window in some ways of like the possibility of human experience and human structure building, but we've done a lot of cool jobs at creating different structures, and so it's really hard to say one of those is going to be without problems. That it's never going to happen. We're on the dialectical roller coaster, whether we like it or not, and things are going to change, and they're going to ebb and flow, and different systems will come up and different systems will come down, and each system builds on the other and has problems that others had, and nothing's perfect. Everything's got a flaw, and I think our experience of things is just the experience of successful things and unsuccessful things and flaws, and that's life. That's the universe. That's how it appears that our universe works. That there are these basic kind of principles of constant change and unpredictability and contradiction, and we're going to have to continuously, for the rest of the time that human beings or anyone is around, going to have to deal with it. And so that's as universal a thing as I can think of, is the kind of you don't step in the same river twice principle. Like things are always changing, and the irony, or maybe to bring it back to the socialism thing, that's what Marx wrote his PhD dissertation on, is these ideas of constant change and a dialectical approaches to things in pre-Socratic thinking. But let's talk
So
about...
I'd heard you. Yeah, no, I just want to wrap it up with something along those lines. That I'd heard you mention this dialectical approach before in some of your other podcasts. Obviously, it's something you're keen on. I don't want to talk about it because I've had no time to study it, except at a very surface level. And I think the summation of it is something along the lines of you can expect every system to be inherently flawed at some point, and possibly even contradictory as well.
Yep.
Which makes everything that you look at suspect at a foundational level.
Yep.
I fundamentally disagree with this. Just at that's to me that's anathema to me. I would hope and expect something like a bedrock foundation of some sort, which is obviously why I hold to objective moral values and duties, of course.
What about it?
It's certainly something I promise I will go away and actually spend some time looking at this dialectical approach in more detail, but it's not something I wanted to discuss. But it's I acknowledge that it's an interesting concept that I need to spend more time on.
Just as out of curiosity, though, what is the kind of core reason for the sort of revulsion of that idea of the sort of inherent contradiction in everything notion, the inability of perfection?
Yeah, basically, yeah.
That there's something for you that doesn't comport with reality or how you kind of want things to work.
Seems I'm making some logical jumps here, but the end state would be, so I'd have to walk you through all of the logical premises in a syllogistic sort of way to get you to the point where I'm about to express. But effectively what it does for me is it makes a mockery of suffering, and it makes a mockery of meaning, because it means there's no ideal. That's really there's no point to strive to anything. I know that doesn't make any sense, but I'm trying to give you the summation of the end state.
I could understand that. I could see that series of syllogisms that would get you to. I mean, if there's no,
well, maybe they're flawed.
If there's
for
no
sure.
absolute system, there you can't create a notion of why you want to strive for X over Y, and so it's really continuously context dependent. And if it's context dependent, one is as good as the other.
What? Exactly. How could you know if you're actually making this thing called progress? Exactly. Okay. Well, I'm really pleased that you conned to that. Clearly, you're much smarter than me. That's fine. Let's jump into some of these questions, if you don't mind.
The hard ones. Yeah.
It's taken me this long to get us here.
That's all right.
My questioning skills are terrible. Yeah. No. It's maybe it's a joint effort in terribleness. Right. Okay. So, here's one I think is good. One you could argue that one metric of a good idea is the ease with which it is implemented.
Yeah.
Now, taking that and looking at every experiment in socialism, Marxism, communism, I can't think of one that's ended well.
Yeah.
So, is that something you agree with, or would you caveat that somehow? Like, how would you explore this idea?
The premise of the idea that the most true thing is the easiest to implement, or this is the kind of Occam's razor idea, right? That if the easiest solution, the more straightforward solution, is obviously the one that's true. In a vacuum, in a situation in which it is the only thing that is needing to be implemented, sure, it's like extremely easy to throw an object if you're outside the International Space Station, because there's very little resistance and you can just let it go and it'll leave. And so I think when you're looking at attempts to implement what we might call socialism. And again, might have to go to the definitions just to recap. But I think, from my view, obviously, we have to bring back the historical, social, cultural, international contingencies of the attempts to implement what we might call "quote unquote" socialism, and to a one, all the experiments that were able to gain something like state power in order to be able to do the process that we kind of would generally recognize would be necessary to implement something that we could really genuinely call socialism. You're not in a situation to be able to do that. Normally, your revolution happens after a period of significant war and results in war afterwards. Again, for a number of historical, social, and culturally contingent reasons. It doesn't have to be that way, but it has been that way in terms of the actual human experience of trying to create a new social system. So I can agree in some ways that the attempts at creating what they or their apologists would want to call socialism cost a lot, and was highly problematic in a number of different ways. The reasons that they were problematic are partially related to the ideology of the actors for whom the revolution was successful in putting into power. It's partially a misunderstanding or a misapplication of, I would say, basic tenets of Marxism, and it's also a significantly non-ideal actual trajectory of how even they thought things were going to happen. For instance, like in the Soviet Union, they were like right away in October of 1917, they basically thought that they could end the war, and they did negotiate an end to the war between Russia and Germany, and that soon thereafter Germany would go into revolution, that there were enough like-minded people that there would be a revolution in Germany, and there was a revolution in Germany, and it was ultimately crushed, and wasn't successful. And that left the Soviet Union essentially on its own, and immediately engulfed in a civil war that killed millions of people and destroyed industry and dissolved what workplace democracy there really was between 1917 and say 1920. And so, like, you have reasons why this kind of degeneration happens in places where this is attempted, for a lot of other reasons that are not just like socialism is a bad idea. It's much, much, much more complicated than, like Marx didn't know enough about human nature, or some of the kinds of things that you might hear. I mean, these are people who are trying to take power against the most powerful people in the world, who have the means, who are expressing that means, particularly in say 1917, of killing millions and millions of people. And so, they are willing to do so. And the Soviet Union was invaded by something like 9 or 13 or some crazy amount of different countries, including countries that were at war with each other in other parts of the world. And so in order to really understand what it was that actually happened in something like the Soviet Union or China or Vietnam or Cuba or even North Korea or something like that, you can't abstract it to such a degree that like socialism is bad or wrong because North Korea. That's a overly simplistic argument that ignores all of the historical, social, cultural, and economic contingencies that allow us to actually understand what the hell is going on in the world. And so in order to like kind of evaluate what is the better, let's say, epistemological approach, as long as we axiomatically say that what would ground the better or worse in terms of our epistemic approach is its ability to understand what's going on in a place and what's happened in history, then the approach of understanding all of the contingencies seems to give a lot sort of more useful and deeper understandings than a kind of what I would say surface level explanation, like the Soviet Union was an attempt to establish socialism. The Soviet Union didn't work, and millions of people died. Therefore, socialism doesn't work. That's not extremely helpful to understand the complexity of something like socialism, and what that word actually means in terms of a philosophic and economic and social perspective, and even whatever exists as like a blueprint for creating a society that looks like that, which I don't think there is, but you can, as an individual socialist, present an idea of what your sort of world, your socialist world would look like. And I've done that, at least on the All Things Co-op podcast, in some ways in this podcast, to be able to say, like, generally what it would look like. But, there isn't a blueprint. There isn't this abstract ability to say, devoid of all historical, social, and cultural contingencies, like, it would be easy or difficult to implement. But like, that's my perspective, I guess, on that. It's a very, very, very deep and complicated question, and to shorthand it in a way of some kind of 3-sentence quote unquote syllogism is not sufficient.
Yeah, no, I agree. I just wanted to get your impression on how you would respond to that. And it was kind of a tricky question because in part it wanted to see if you would acknowledge the fact that some of these attempts have been failures.
Sure. Yep.
Because it's very common in a discussion with a socialist that they'll say, well, what do you mean they failed? In many ways they were successful. You're like, well, okay, how were they successful? Oh, well, they had medical systems that were really good.
Yeah, I mean,
or they had a good education system, or we abolished religion.
It depends on the axiomatic. It depends on the axiomatic position that you want to use to say successful. So, does successful mean raising the standard of living? Then, in that sense, all quote unquote socialist projects have been successful. Is it success creating a society in which people are able to flourish to the greatest degree? Then I would say that they were not successful. And so, is success rapid industrialization so that you can be the first people to put something into orbit above the Earth? Well, then the Soviet Union was a success, especially as compared to the United States. But if success means that you have some ability to participate in your government, frankly, I would think both of them are basically equal. I think that in many ways, the Soviet people had about as much ability to affect their government as the American people did. The only real difference being that the American government is more willing to put up with protests than the Soviet government was. But if the protests were to get rowdy enough, the United States is more than willing to clamp down, and has shown itself more than capable and willing to do so when it feels sufficiently threatened by radical and revolutionary forces.
I'm at a road between two, or what is it? A river betwixt two. A road betwixt two. On the one hand, I want to challenge your statement that the American government clamps down particularly hard on quote unquote protesters.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't want to get into a discussion about BLM and Antifa.
Sure. I was more thinking of the Black Panthers and the American Communist Party. I think they were clamped down on in a way that Black Lives Matter is not.
Yeah, I think they were. I think, yeah, you're probably right there.
Yeah.
I think in general, though, I think the ability to protest is not something that's typically infringed upon. I think there's a heavy political price to pay in Western society for clamping down too tightly on protest. I think
yes, but
in
there's
America recently with a lot of the Antifa BLM riots.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, most of them were protests. Let's be clear, most of them were protests. Yeah. There were several thousand protests over the course of an extended period of time, and only a small percentage were actually devolved into rioting.
Yes.
Nevertheless, there's enough rioting overall that I think they probably should have clamped down more, honestly.
Protests and riots are both spectacles. They accomplish.
Yeah, that's right.
They accomplish very little, and they're often very controlled. So even riots, for as much as it seems out of control, like the police created barriers, and there was red lines that even the rioters knew in many places. And so the
It's a relief valve
it's
in a
an
way.
absolutely important relief valve that if you
Yeah.
that republics, like, so liberal sort of bourgeois republics, learned that from the experience of the revolutions of 1848 and 1789 in France, and or even earlier a little bit in Britain, of like, you can't clamp down so hard because when you do, people throw bombs at you. And so what you need to do is give them some ability to like affect change, and that will placate them enough. And so that's what liberal republics have learned. And so there's always this like right to protest. But the right to protest is always abrogatable and limited. So you can't have an unsanctioned protest. Even in the United States, you can't just march down the street. The cops won't protect
Yeah,
you.
quite
They'll
right.
stop you. You have to get a fucking permit to have a protest.
Permit. Yeah.
And so
Yeah, I
these
agree.
are the original, start of Black Lives Matter protests in Ferguson were always subject to, this is an illegal assembly, and subject to mass arrests because illegal assemblies, quote unquote, are against the rules, despite in America a First Amendment right to assemble. So, when push comes to shove, even quote unquote sacred rights are obviously abrogated in order to ensure the long-term stability of ultimately the economic mode of production that's going on, and all of the social relations therefrom.
Yeah. No, I agree. There's a tension between the ability to protest and interfering with other people's everyday lives.
Mhm.
And I think that's where this idea of the permit comes from. I think it is abused sometimes, for sure.
Yeah.
But in general, I would be more in favor of it than not.
Yeah.
Just because otherwise you just end up with too much chaos.
Mhm.
Trying to think what is the best next. So following on from this conversation about successful attempts at implementing this ideal of socialism, and just to be fair to you, I think it's worth pointing out, it was not, and harkening back to the Richard Wolff debate, it was not easy to discover what it is that people mean by socialism. So if I'm to sum it up succinctly and correctly, and please correct me if I'm wrong, your version of socialism that you would implement is like this environment, this nationhood, this thing where private property is outlawed, and the primary mechanism for employment would be co-ops. So not the authoritarian, totalitarian style single government actor is the employer thing that we had in Russia, but a democratization of the majority of workplaces. Is that right? Have I done justice to you, or is that?
It's close enough. I mean, especially for the purposes of the conversation. I mean, so if I want to be super pedantic and super clear, but I'll also be super quick. In my view, socialism is actually a transition period between capitalism and communism. And then I would describe communism as a system that is devoid of the employer-employee relationship,
Right.
and that I could even in some ways stop there, and that workplaces are organized in some kind of democratic fashion, and that production is oriented towards the fulfillment of basic and fundamental needs first and foremost, and then to allow in sort of widespread and wide open engagement in other kinds of pursuits, which do not necessitate, which you don't do in order to get your basic needs. Your basic needs are taken care of, so you participate in them freely, that you're able to essentially freely associate your labor. So a system that is made up of worker-owned, managed, and controlled enterprises that workers can freely associate with, and can do so because their basic needs are taken care of by an oriented kind of what we might call a plan, but essentially just a sort of facilitation mechanism to make sure that there are enough producers of food and housing and healthcare and some of these basic kinds of basic needs, so that people can be freed from the fetter of needing to pay sort of pay for basic needs, and so that they can engage in economic relationships outside of that in terms of luxury goods and other kinds of commodity production that are not strictly necessary for the standard of living that we might call a quote unquote middle class life in Australia. So it's, and because I find somewhat problematic this notion of private property, because I know Marx was using private property in a very specific definition. We often colloquially use private property in a very different way, and so maybe a helpful distinction would be personal property is property that you can easily control and is necessary to kind of like fulfill your basic needs. So means of transportation, clothing, house, these kinds of things are your personal possessions. Then private property would be basically the ability to own something that's productive, basically that you can then employ another person and extract surplus value from their labor. That would be be made illegal. But the ability to claim possession of a piece of property in order to develop a house on it, or to be able to modify it in a way that is suitable for you, is more than legitimate and protectable by some kind of legal system.
Yeah, no, and I should have asked you that question as well. I realized because I've through my research I've discovered what the difference is between personal property and private property.
Yeah.
But it certainly wasn't something that was obvious, and
Yeah.
it certainly wasn't something that was easy to find.
It's when you read, we're for the abolition of private property in the Communist Manifesto. Most people at that point go, well, fuck these people, because
And they check out
they think we're going to take their
intellectually.
toothbrush.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And well, this leads me into my next question, right? The what another measure of a good idea is the communicatability of that concept, right? Why is it so hard to communicate the ideals of socialism? What makes this so difficult?
The propagandistic value of a system that is attempting to live out the ideals of the revolutionary ideals that created the system that we actually currently know is very, it's a very high propaganda value. And so for a long time, from the 1830s into the 1930s, socialists were very, very, very capable of communicating their ideas, of getting mass followings, of getting, like majorities in parliaments, and in the United States, getting almost 10% of the presidential vote. Socialism was a very well understood social phenomenon in which everybody knew somebody who was a socialist, and it wasn't weird, and it wasn't creepy, and it wasn't like, ooh, and you didn't have these kind of instant sort of revulsions. And so the reason that socialism has become very hard to communicate is that there was this dual propaganda campaign by the Soviet Union to say what we're doing is socialism, to grab onto the kind of high moralistic values that socialism represented, and why it was so easy to communicate to people, living out the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity, and actually creating a system that would allow us to participate as genuine human beings instead of cogs in machines and as commodities, and to be able to, have all these structures of exploiting surplus labor and all this kind of stuff, that instead we would, create a system that was living out some of these base human impulses like mutuality and solidarity and fairness. And so there was a high propaganda value for the Soviet Union to say, hey, look, we're trying to do this. And then there was this other propaganda value from the United States by saying, they say that they're trying to do all these good things, and look at what's fucking happening there. It's a nightmare. So socialism is bad. And so on both sides, you have this warped view that everyone sort of has to say that the Soviet Union is socialism. And that, when the Soviet Union encounters numerous problems, from gulags and world wars and attempted coups, and ultimately the inability to maintain the Soviet Union, the um, the continued positive propagandistic value of socialism is difficult. It's kind of been, Hitch called Joseph Stalin the gravedigger of communism, and I think that's a fair statement. That you've had a number of people and a number of consequences and situations. It's not just this megalomania of a single person. It's all these really bad consequences and really bad situations that are, again, historically, socially, culturally, and economically contingent that produce these crazy situations. But that has consequences, and part of it was to significantly retard the ability of genuine socialists from making their case while still claiming the mantle of socialism for what value it used to have. And I think that was my whole point with Destiny when he said, why even use socialism? Well, because it still has value. It's still a tradition that can have those positive propagandistic values, but we're going to have to fight real hard to do. And that's my frustration with a lot of online leftists, is that, hey, talks of guillotines and all of these kinds of things do not help the propagandistic value. Sorry. That's what happens
it's all
when you
good.
talk too
All good.
much.
Yeah. Okay, so this really plays into my next question. And I'm trying to figure out the best way to conceptualize it. And say, I should have written this one down. I thought I had, but I didn't. But effectively, it goes something like this.
Mhm.
You've mentioned that one of the reasons that that your version of socialism, this communist state where you have co-ops in place, hasn't yet occurred, and part of the reason it hasn't yet occurred is because it needs to compete with and fight with these oppressive capitalistic systems that seek to dominate society. I'm trying to paraphrase and add, but please correct me if I'm wrong. And that's a major reason why it hasn't been successful. So the question is, should not the system that you are trying to promote be stronger than any system around it? And the reason I ask that question is, I could envisage a time, I can conceptualize a world where, say, somehow, I don't know how it would happen, but somehow a majority of the world's population live in countries that are now communist states, right? It seems to me what you're saying is that it's not what you're saying, but the perception here is that communism can't stand up to capitalism. And so the question would be, why isn't the system strong enough to withstand the onslaught or the attack or the problems associated with trying to compete with a capitalist system? If a capitalist system is overall better at competing, then in a way it's more successful, and I'm using quote unquotes.
Yeah.
How can you make this communist system that you're striving for competitive enough that you could get to it without having to undergo horrible, terrible, bloody revolution and exert that outcome through force of will? How do you get there when it in theory can't be shown to be able to compete successfully?
The reason why there has been violent, bloody revolutions has because attempts to reform already existing systems towards new circumstances and new developments in technology, or usually technology, force the people who essentially have entrenched power to engage in violence or campaigns against those who are promoting a system for which the people who are in power currently will not benefit. And so there's always going to be an inherent disadvantage of the people who have already existing entrenched power and those who are seeking it. Those who are seeking it are obviously going to have less of the levers of traditional power, namely the state, in order to attempt to implement the system for which they are ideologically committed. So the means by which states and governments and even individuals, like let's say owners of production, have gone to stifle the attempts at creating structures of, at minimum, greater worker participation in the decisions of a business, and at maximum, the attempt to overcome the state by a political force that at least has its stated objective of expropriating the owners, that these are significantly dangerous developments in terms of the labor force or the working class or the masses or whatever you might want to call them, that the decision has, at least historically, has consistently historically been to engage in a campaign of violence or some kind of crackdown, you know, for like campaigns that take out the heads of organizations to the creation of the Third Reich. And so I think the difficulty of creating the system that we want to implement is one which we are, one, at an inherent disadvantage, and two, we don't have access to the levers of power that can reorient the status quo, at least to allow us to compete on something like a level playing field. And so there's been this constant discussion among socialists and communists about whether or not we participate in parliaments, because one side of it says we're giving legitimacy to this bourgeois state that's only existing to maintain capitalism, and the other one say, well, we can make sort of necessary and useful reforms within this system to be able to like give us advantages that we wouldn't have if it was some kind of czarist autocracy. So there are things that we could do now that would give cooperatives, which I think are the actual future, not state ownership and control of the means of production, but worker control over the means of production via this cooperative ideal, needs to have the same playing field that traditional capitalist organizations have. And traditional capitalist organizations are greatly benefited and assisted by the government. It is actually essentially what the government is there to do. It's to facilitate private enterprise or free enterprise or the capitalist system or whatever you want to call it. So its apparatus is market stability and the ability for, business people, entrepreneurs, to start businesses and employ people, because this whole system is based on a small group employing and a large group working. And so it does everything to maintain that. It doesn't have an interest, and it isn't used to, and it can, which is nice, but it's not used to, it's not oriented in this way, do the same kind of things for cooperatives. It doesn't currently, but in principle it could. The only way that it could is if you get enough people into positions of power in which you could actually legislate this reorientation of government action towards, at minimum, equal assistance to capitalist and cooperative enterprises. Again, looking at at history in terms of attempts to even do this, even something like this, the capitalists understand what a threat this is to the system that they benefit from, and they do greatly benefit. I mean, right? I mean, Jeff Bezos is about to send himself into suborbit, but they have historically engaged in preemptive strikes and preemptive preventions against these kinds of movements, tame as they might be, or like reorientation of the Small Business Administration or something like that. There are constant efforts, both subtle and surreptitious, to open confrontationally and violent attempts to disallow workers getting together in unions or workers organizing themselves into cooperatives. And so there becomes this inflection point where you say, if the current political structure is so oriented to maintaining the capitalist mode of production, and the capitalists have all of this interest in maintaining it for themselves and are willing to employ grotesque levels of violence to maintain it, then we can't simply get elected into parliament and call a constitutional convention to create a new socialist economy. Because if we attempt to do that, hired armies from the capitalists will come after us. That's at least historically what has happened. Now, it may not, and it could be in principle possible that we totally legislatively and parliamentarian style get us into socialism. It's theoretically possible, but it isn't if you're looking at historical, social, cultural, and economic contingencies of the past and of the present, likely. It's not going to happen that way. So that you will need some kind of mechanism to have what you would call a revolution, to be able to say the old system is absolved and no longer sovereign, no longer able to make laws, it is defunct. And a new system will take its place. And then we can ask a lot of questions about what that new system will look like and how that constitution will be set up, and those are legitimate questions. But ultimately, for me, you want to do as much as you can to do reforms. Let's get in America, the Democratic Socialists of America elected on their own ticket, not with the Democratic Party, and so they can advocate for increased help for unions and cooperatives. But ultimately, we need to be able to create a genuinely revolutionary party that knows that there will be a certain time in which actions we have to take in that will create a break, in which we can say on, depending on what calendar you're using, let's say November 7th or 8th of 1917, the provisional government of the Russian Empire is no longer the seat of power, and it is going to be transferred to the all Russian Supreme Soviet, and they will have sovereign power. I think that will ultimately be necessary, but I think that, and you can use the example of the Russian Revolution in terms of October, can be completely bloodless. That you can really do that by just having overwhelming force. And so it becomes difficult because you can't just assume that cooperatives will be able to develop themselves into this competing force. They need the government structure to do that. You won't be able to get the government sufficiently able to do that under its current system, so that you need to adopt this revolutionary position, not because you want to cosplay as Leon Trotsky, but because you recognize that it's going to be essential at some point to create a break and to make that shift. And you have to be prepared for it. And you don't, again, I think there's a lot of very ridiculous discussions about what revolution means and what it actually looks like. But what it looks like is a declaration of a organization that's willing to take power, ending the structure that, to say, let's say in the United States, that the U.S. Constitution is no longer the valid law, which is what we did in the United States after we got rid of the Articles of Confederation and adopted the U.S. Constitution. So this isn't like fucking crazy. It can totally happen, and has happened in a number of different countries where there's been constitutional reform. We're just talking about a constitutional reform that is much more significant and a genuine break, because we're adopting a new form of a mode of production in which there isn't this ability for some individuals to own and control and other individuals to be employed at. And so the real break and the real advancement in this new constitutional reform is an additional provision that abolishes, in Marxist terms, private property, or at least the private ownership of means of production. That all means of production will be collectively owned by the people who contribute labor to that enterprise. And that's not super crazy. I mean, you could think of a constitution that would say that, similarly as we've got constitutions that say that you cannot own another human being. It's not, there are limitations that we place even in constitutions on both the government's ability to do things and individuals' rights to do things, like own other people. And I think that we could just as similarly make a constitution that's illegal, that makes illegal the exploitation of individuals via the employer-employee relationship. So I don't know. I guess that's how you both can and can't avoid what we might normally think of as revolutions, because most people think of the worst bloody days of the French Revolution when they think of revolutions, and they don't think of the usurpation of the Articles of Confederation for the U.S. Constitution, or other or the October Revolution in 1917 in Russia, which was really just you know the abolition of the previous
Sure.
government.
Yes, the question was more around how does a communist state compete with its capitalist neighbors is more. But this I like this train of thought because it goes into a subsequent question, which is how can you? Okay, so just to be clear, you don't think it's really possible within the framework of a democratic system to actually get to a communist state without some sort of revolution.
If by democratic you mean what I would call kind of liberal bourgeois democracy, yes. Yeah. I think
Okay.
there are sufficient fetters in the structures of those, which are often not very democratic. They're republics for reasons, which is essentially to restrict the amount of democracy, because there's been this notion that you can't trust the rabble with important decisions. So there's a kind of elitism and class structure to liberal democracies, because it represents and relates to the mode of production in which it's there to support.
I would kind of posit that every society that has ever existed, with maybe a few exceptions, have always had an elite system or hierarchical.
Yep. Any civilization,
elite
yes.
system.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, so but this typifies one of my not an objection, but one of my conceptualizations of why I think we will never reach the communist state is because it doesn't appear that it can compete in natural terms. Like, if I wanted to promote a political system and a economic system that was better than capitalism, to me, it would have to be able to not only be better, but be better able to take you from capitalism to it, without this sort of revolutionary step. Maybe that's too simplistic a view of what the ideal system should be, right? And maybe that's not nuanced enough, but it seems to me to be a legitimate criticism to say, well, this system that you want to go to can't get to where it needs to in and of itself, and so it can't be a superior system. So, I mean, that's
so there's two things. One, we do have to talk then about what we mean by compete, I guess, in some ways, and succeed, right? So towards what goals and to what end? What is our hypothetical imperative there? If it's to maintain power in concentrated hands, I think capitalism does have the upper hand in that kind of system. I mean, we're intentionally devolving traditionally existent hierarchies, and so there's a sense that, look at all that we've achieved under class systems. Why would you want to get rid of it? There also is, though, if there hasn't obviously, and there's not usually a good way to have some kind of experiment in the real world where you'd be able to set up a cooperative economy and compete it against a capitalist economy, and to see what the results there would be between those two, in terms of maybe the differences of standard of living and ability to own and control your actual life and the availability of resources and all these kinds of things. It would be very interesting to see what the results of that would be. This is unfortunately where we have to stake down our ideological flags and say, I don't think that there is a sufficient reason to think or to posit that cooperatives couldn't do at minimum just as good a job as what we have now. And I would say that in terms of standard of livings and access to resources and all those kind of things, and for me, I would go the step further of saying I would think that cooperatives would have a cooperative economy oriented towards, in this kind of communist way, using those in my view interchangeably, that there would be greater access to resources, greater access to ownership and control of your own life and the desires that you have and the labor that you can employ, and a definite increase in the kind of standard of living, in the sense of being able to provide for obviously all your basic needs and then some. So, excuse me, I think in all ways, there's no reason to think that cooperatives wouldn't be able to, again, do just as good. And there's a lot of reasons to think that they would do better. And so, just as you really couldn't say in France in 1788 that the capitalists could, genuinely compete with the monarchist French army, they um, they still had a more progressive system. They still had a system that was enshrining more, I'd say, civil and political rights, not necessarily social, cultural, and economic, but civil and political rights that didn't exist in the previous feudal system. And so, in that sense, they weren't able to compete, but it was still a quote unquote better system, because when it was ultimately successful in implanting itself, it produced a higher standard of living, a greater amount of freedom, a higher amount of ownership and control of your kind of daily life, and was in that sense an advancement on the feudal system. So there's no reason to think that the communist system, so oriented as I would describe it, wouldn't be that same kind of quote unquote progressive force, so long as we're judging progressive by increases in standard of living, increases in access to resources, increased ability to own and control your life, and some other, again, axiomatic positions that I would assert is how we should judge whether or not a mode of production is able to quote unquote compete or is better than another. So, because you could make the argument that capitalism is more than willing to blow itself up in order to even allow some parts of it to better have access to resources, increase standards of living, things like that. Like there have been a number of wars between capitalist governments that are an expression of the system's ability to exert power in this, like to the point of killing millions of people. So in that sense, it may be more successful because it may be more willing to do that kind of harm than a system that has as some of its core values, like aversions to that, where there's nothing in principle in capitalism that would prevent or would give you a reason to not go to war, depending on the circumstances. And so, we're talking about potentially different systems, but I just don't see a reason why one could claim that co-ops just can't compete. If you are saying, if the argument is that they can't compete because they never have, that ignores all of the historical, social, cultural, and economic contingencies under which these projects were attempted. And so if you, again, try to abstract things, then you're missing the idea that the ocean is 2 miles deep and the anchor might tear us down.
Sure.
Yeah.
So, okay. So moving on from that, but building on top of it, right? Let's just posit a world where you've got all of the countries. Let's just say you don't have a one world government, but you do have almost all, if not all, of the countries in the world have become communist states. Right? Not sure how we got there. Hopefully, it'd be as bloodless a revolution as possible. Human life is valuable.
Yep.
And I will come back to this point because I do want to talk about the transition on a little bit.
Okay.
But let's just posit this world where you have almost all of the countries in the world have become communist states.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the countries decides, you know what, we're going to go back to capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
Can they be allowed to do that? Because in theory, if they can be allowed to do that, then they would outcompete these communist states, right?
Only if we adopt the supposition or presupposition that capitalism will always outcompete communism. Then yes. Then
right.
In principle, syllogistically, you'd be right. Again, I would the point I would say is that that may be a valid argument, but it's not a cogent one, in the sense that it's properly structured, but it isn't ultimately true. Um, I don't think that if you had a worldwide system of, let's say, cooperative governments, that one, there would be sufficient incentive to have some kind of breakaway capitalist republic of some kind. But I also wouldn't. I don't know that you could prevent it, and I don't know that you would want to. And I think that ultimately, if we're in a situation where most of the world is living under the kind of cooperative economy that I have described in several places and even a little bit here, that workers would choose to go there or to stay there, unless there could be the promise that under all whatever rubrics that you use that each individual worker would value, that system would be able to increase it. Maybe. I wouldn't. I'm not suggesting that it was impossible for some people. I mean, I think after the French Revolution, there were enough monarchists to reestablish monarchy in France. So it's not crazy to think that there would be a kind of sufficient enough counter-revolutionary forces in some place that would want to give it an old college try. And more power to you. I'd be very surprised to see a liberated working class that owns and controls its own production in 99% of the world to go to the 1% of the world in which it couldn't own and control the means of production. Unless that world was somehow so much better, which again, if I think about it, I'm not sure on what grounds I would have to assert that it would be better, that it would somehow so outcompete the rest of the world in all measures that would be sufficient to ultimately make enough workers choose to give up their ownership control, free access to resources, and free association of labor to knowingly engage in an employer-employee relationship. I don't think liberated people would choose to go back to their chains, frankly.
Or people who weren't liberated would forget, right? Is an argument that I would posit. So if you were under a system where you were raised in that system, you may be tempted away from that system quite easily because you don't know the pain of getting there and you don't know the pain of the past. Human beings have a limited lifespan.
Yep.
And so we seem to be doomed to repeat the mistakes of the previous generation in every generation.
At the same time,
my wife has just started cooking breakfast.
Oh.
If it's too loud, just let me know.
Oh no, you're good. I also
you
want
can't-
you to be able to eat breakfast. The timer on the recording says 2 hours and 20 minutes. So
and
we can pause and start again anytime.
Yeah, well, I'm happy to keep going.
Okay.
I think I might want to just request that we have a part 2 already because
You gotta get the co-ops
I had two. Well, I haven't even started on the co-ops. I've only gotten through. I've got so many questions around the mechanics of how co-ops would work, and I haven't even got there yet.
Yeah.
But I did want to talk about this concept of transition, right? So,
Yeah. Okay.
So a remarkable event happened in recent history, which was this transition of the British protectorate of Hong Kong from a British colony protectorate. I don't know what the legal term was. To reverting control back to China, right? And people were jumping ship like crazy. Like people with disposable income, people with assets, were fleeing the country as quick as they possibly could. And I don't know what percentage of the total population of Hong Kong actually left, but I know it was a lot.
Yeah.
So let's just say we're in the middle of a transition. Something happens and we're transitioning to a communist state in America or Australia or somewhere. How are you going to stop rich people or just average everyday people with lots of assets who were never part of the bourgeoisie, but were just really successful workers, perhaps boutique workers who found a way, a niche to get wealthy. How are you going to stop them from taking all their wealth and fleeing? What? How do you stop that from happening, or do you just let it happen and then hope it doesn't have a detrimental effect on the country?
Uh,
And
yeah.
as a side question to that, how do you deal with the loss of expertise? Right. So one of
Yeah.
the I know I'm compounding this question, but I wanted to get it out there.
Mhm.
How do you deal with, like in Zimbabwe, when they a lot of the white farmers had their land appropriated from them and given to mates of Mugabe?
Mhm.
You know, a significant amount of expertise in agricultural development was lost,
Yeah.
and now you had a country which used to be the breadbasket of Southern Africa is now importing uh, food and maize
Yeah.
because they can't figure out how to grow it. Right? Like,
Yeah.
how do you deal with these economic and expertise issues of transition?
Um, it's a good question because in terms of how we can actually see this kind of thing going down. So like I'll give you the cop out answer in some ways. The quick cop out answer is, in order for this project to be successful, it essentially needs to be worldwide and worldwide quick. Um, and so while there will be some modicum of transfers between places in terms of both expertise and I would say money rather than real wealth or capital. I think most of the capital is in the productive, um, in sort of the productive enterprises, and so you'll retain most of the productive enterprises because they're actually situated in your geographical territory, and so you'll be able to reorient them very quickly to generating, uh, new capital. That capital may be divided or distributed differently, but you'd still be able to generate capital because that generate capital is generated by the use of human labor. And so, capital is stored labor. So um, there will be a certain amount of this transfer, and it may cause problems and hiccups in terms of the transition. I wouldn't doubt that. But the idea would be that if it's genuinely in some ways revolutionary, the globalization of the world means that ultimately genuine revolutionary conditions won't merely exist in one place. This kind of class revolution, this bigger socialist revolution, rather than a transition away from one dictator to another, or a dictator to a republic or something like that, it is almost necessarily, and has at least in the past been connected to other attempts to do this. There have been blocks created, obviously, and those kind of things that were not always just sort of Soviet imperialism, but were genuine, like bringing together of independent states and stuff like that. So, um, that's a sort of a cop out answer. I just think that we would ultimately be able to deal with it in the sense that I do. This may sound again like a cop out too, but I take the approach that just as industrialization and industrial technology was the driving force of ending feudalism and bringing about capitalism, information technology is actually what's going to be able to bring about socialism. And so much of this sort of necessary knowledge that's encapsulated in the heads of human beings is already decreasing significantly over time through the process of documentation and software that uses certain sets of documentation to run um, things that would otherwise take a significant amount of expertise. And we're only on the path of exponential growth on that. Not that there aren't limits, but we're doing pretty well at being able to use complex algorithmic and machine learning types of things to create systems that would otherwise take a great deal of expertise that no longer do. So it's the technological change that the internet and this connectivity and productivity via coding, essentially software engineering, that will be the thing that will allow us to really liberate ourselves from some of these other kinds of constraints, namely how much human beings need to be involved in this process and how much human knowledge, intelligence, and labor is necessary to produce enough commodities and basic goods that would give the general population a standard of living that we would all be relatively happy with. And so I'm not trying to say that there wouldn't be some problems, and that I think, not to say that Cuba is in any way some kind of an incredible place. There is a situation where you do have decreases even in the standard of living, but increases in the quality of life, and you have the ability to have a certain amount of brain drain and the removal of your major trading partner, and through commitments to community solidarity and human development, still create a society that has a higher infant mortality rate than the largest economy in the world. And so, I just think that so properly oriented, that even suffering a kind of wealth and or expertise drain, that what remains in the country, which I think would be the majority of it, which always is actually the majority of it. It's not as if the majority of Hong Kong or the majority of Cubans left when these events happened. You will be able to pick up the pieces, and it will ultimately have it. I think Zimbabwe is an example of, not replacing a colonial possession with a cooperative economy or some kind of even Soviet style socialism, but a horrible capitalist kleptocracy that were very beneficial to opening to Western business interests and maintaining a stranglehold on the large working class of Zimbabwe. And so I think it's in some ways an indictment of the incentives and the potentials of state-oriented capitalism than it is actually a concern that we would have if what we're actually proposing is progressive and producing in some of those some of the measures by which we would say one system might be better than the other would ultimately be better. And so there's enough incentives to get us through whatever brain drain or wealth drain we may experience in the initial transition phases.
Okay. So, harkening back to the, because we've talked about various components of communism, how we define it, how we would get there, what it would look like, all this stuff. But I'm remiss in not actually asking this question earlier, which is, what is it that you would say? How would you describe, or what would you point at as being the foundational components of this communist ideal that, if they were not true, would invalidate the theory? In other words, which foundational components of the system, if not true, would mean that communism is not going to be the ideal place to go? And as an example, if we were talking about Christianity, you could posit that if Jesus wasn't, the Son of God, and he didn't die on a cross, and he wasn't a real dude, he wasn't actually even there, then that would make that religion fall apart, right? Like, he's a central figure and tenant of that religion. If he's not there, if it doesn't work, if you could prove that he didn't exist somehow, I don't know how you would do that, but then the whole thing just falls apart. What is the consummate thing in communism, this ideal that you're looking for, which correlates to that? Is it the labor theory of value?
No.
Could you? No.
It's if the proletariat is not the agent of revolutionary change. So if the proletariat isn't the agent of revolutionary change, then establishing what you might call communism in terms of the worker control and ownership of the means of production and the elimination of class divisions would not be possible. That would in some ways invalidate the potential for what we might call communism. I think this is the position that Hitch and other people essentially argued, that the proletariat was at some point potentially an agent of revolutionary change, and I think Marx was kind of recognizing that. But even Marx said they have to, the class has to become aware of itself as a class, and then not only as a class, but as a class that has this revolutionary potential. And so it has to do those things in order to be able to like have enough combined power to stop, to have a kind of general strike, and to stop capitalist production such that you can create a revolutionary moment where you'd be able to take over you'd be able to institute this kind of revolutionary switch from the old system to the new system, abolish private property, and then attempt to create the mechanisms to run the enterprises via worker control. And so if the proletariat isn't ultimately that agent of revolutionary change, and there's some other agent of revolutionary change, which could be AI. If we get GAI, then general artificial intelligence, then that may be a sufficient agent for revolutionary change, which may not eliminate class divisions necessarily, but may revolutionize, may change class structures and may create a new ruling class, in which there may be a ruling class of people who sufficiently understand like the structures of machine learning and artificial intelligence, such that they can orient that towards their interest. Maybe the GAI system does it for itself, similar to like what you see in Westworld or something like that. So for me, that would be the thing that would invalidate the kind of the communist proposal, is that if the proletariat doesn't recognize itself as a class, doesn't recognize its revolutionary potential as a class, and doesn't engage in the revolution, then communism, as I would define it, or I think anyone understands it, would be essentially impossible.
Right, but that's talking about the vehicle of change, right? Not the value system of change. So, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're describing, the working man, if they can't figure out, if they don't understand that they are the agents of change that need to occur.
Mhm.
Well, what we're talking about there is a vehicle for change, right? We're changing the hearts and minds of your everyday person to go out there, seize political power, seize control of what's going on around them,
Mhm.
to collaborate and coordinate and to effectuate that change. Well, that's a vehicle for change.
Mhm.
But what I'm surprised you didn't address, it's not a criticism necessarily, but it's just a surprise
Mhm.
to me, is the value system that determines that communism is the right course of action. So
Mhm.
I was hoping to dig in a little bit deeper. Like, I agree with you, by the way. I don't disagree with you at all. If
Mhm.
the working class, which I don't know if I'm not willing to say that I accept the classification of a working class. I need to look at this theory of class-based society. Clearly, we have class systems.
Mhm.
I just don't know how I feel about it and how I would describe it.
Okay.
But if the average common working person, shouldn't say working man, it's a very egalitarian society we
Mhm.
live in these days.
Mhm.
If the working person who makes up the majority doesn't recognize that they can effectuate this change, then you're right, absolutely, you'll never get to that end state. But if we could pursue this concept of values a little bit,
Mhm.
why is it that the labor theory of value, which Marx goes into great detail on,
Mhm.
isn't an underpinning concept for you? I was surprised that you.
The labor theory of value is just an explanation that in some ways helps describe the difference between exchange value and use value, and how the like and so it's not, to me it's not in any way essential. I mean, it's maybe useful as a means to understand how capitalism works, but it's not at all essential um to constructing what I would consider to be a communist state.
Right, but the justification that the bourgeoisie, the owners of business, the owners of enterprise, the reason they're morally bankrupt is because they're extracting surplus value from the workers, right? and that concept is predicated on the concept of the acceptance of the labor theory of value, right?
It's I'm not sure that it's actually premised. I think that you can make an argument without talking about how something gets value, because you could just
Okay.
talk about it in the relations of production in some way, like just the idea that the ability to make profit. I mean, you could make it much more simple than Marx does, obviously, but like um, you can describe the usurpation of surplus value simply in the sense of saying that um, a working person makes less than how much the capitalist sells it for. And so in that process, there is an extraction of there's a distribution of value in terms of between what is paid for the labor and what ultimately the commodity produced gets at the market, the price of that. And so you could use even classical economics, not even Marxian economics, to come up with the theory of the extraction of surplus value. So it's not super essential to me that you need the labor theory of value to do a lot of heavy lifting in terms of thinking about what kind of post class structure you could come up with. It's really more valuable to understand how the capitalist system works if you want to make this long-winded argument about not the moral bankruptcy of capitalists, but actually the inherent contradictions of capitalism that will ultimately preclude it from realizing its kind of stated goals. And so the labor theory of value is much more valuable as a critique of capitalism than it is a justification for what you would need in communism. And so that's why for me it doesn't have that kind of importance. I mean, I think it's an interesting way to discuss value, and I think value theory is important and a kind of useful philosophical enterprise, but it isn't necessary to um, to make a basic argument for why the relations of production between employer and employee are at minimum problematic and are at maximum morally unjustifiable.
Right, but you just use that term, morally unjustifiable.
Mm-hmm.
How do you get there? This is the thinking that I'm interested. Like if you're not using the labor theory of value as a moral justification for why capitalism is bad,
Mm-hmm.
and the extraction of surplus value from labor is bad, like how do that's the interesting. What was the term that you used? It was
Uh, Unjustifiable, I think.
morally
Yeah, I'm
unjustifiable.
not
How
sure.
do you get there? Like, can you walk me through how you get there?
Um, the difficulty for me is I would have to try to come up with the argument that would for which it was morally justifiable to extract value from other people. Um, like so,
But
the
other people would just view that in terms of profit and loss, right? If I've got a
yeah.
business and I manufacture socks,
Mm-hmm.
I get the wool in, I have the
Yeah.
machines, but I have people who do stuff on the machines. I've got 10
Yeah.
employees. I pay them, let's say I'm a good boss and I pay them twice what the minimum wage is, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they're happy. They're getting the thing, but I make
Yep.
unbelievably good quality socks.
Yeah.
I use special merino wool.
Yeah.
I sell it on the intertubes and I'm making great profit because it's a boutique item and it's a profitable little business.
Yep.
I can't see how it would grow beyond 10 people, but I've got 10 people working for me and the wife does all the accounting and the payroll and the HR stuff. And I take care of this other stuff, whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm profitable,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I make $200,000 a year profit.
Mm-hmm.
Like, why is that morally bad?
It will first depend on what axioms we will set down as the way in which we can evaluate the moral claim, right? So, um, as a flag post, it isn't necessary to use the moral framework. I think that you could use capital and other writings and other criticisms of capitalism to make an amoral claim as to the insufficiency of capitalism to ultimately survive its internal contradictions, but we'll leave that to the side and go to the moral. You gotta then stake your claim in terms of what you are going to judge as moral or not. What's a better moral system and what's not? What's a morally justified action and what is a morally unjustified action? In the case of the expropriation of surplus value by a traditional capitalist, that I will not use the middle class person who is also a worker and who's actually contributing their labor, but a traditional capitalist who simply employs labor and then gets the extraction of surplus value, right? I think that's a clear division. I know it's not always the most easy for people to understand because a lot of people are working in a place that has a middle class owner of the company, but we're talking about traditional owners, capitalists, in the sense of people who simply use capital in order to buy labor that generates greater capital.
Sorry, can you? Sorry,
Yeah.
I'm really sorry. Can you restate that? Because I think I missed the first part. And so you talked to me about the division. You talked about two things, but I think I missed the first part somehow. Do you mind starting again? Would that be all right?
We have to do you want me to start where we're saying we have to set down our axiomatic claims?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, perfect.
So we got to set down those in order to decide whether or not the ability for, again, the traditional capitalist to simply purchase labor at a certain price and get the surplus value that labor creates. For me, the value that I would use in order to make this evaluation is essentially fairness. Fairness in terms of giving to those what is due. And so if I say that we can evaluate two different systems on whether or not it is giving people essentially what is their just due, what is as closely related to let's see, what's the proceeds that they get from whatever it is that they're doing are commensurate with the amount of effort or action or whatever that it takes to do so. And we set two different structures. One that is a traditional, say, capitalist enterprise that has this extraction of surplus value that essentially some individuals are producing X amount but are only getting Y, and Y is less than X. And then we compare that to a system where, on the whole, not perfectly, but on the whole, or even to a greater degree, the delta between X and Y is less. If we can compare a system that has a greater amount of differentiation between the value that someone creates through their labor and the value that they receive in terms of remuneration, and a system that and that gives them a certain amount, and a system that gives them a greater amount that is more closely related to the actual value they produce, then as they compare, one is not justifiable because we have a better system that we could implement. So in the case of this cooperative versus, or a communist versus a capitalist system, the fact that we could create a system in which the individuals engaged in enterprise can be given a greater amount of the value that they create through their labor, it makes the continuation of a system that decreases that has a decreased amount of that, morally unjustifiable at minimum, as compared to a system that could do it better. And I think that we have enough grounds and enough sort of philosophical and social capability to envision a system that would decrease the amount of delta between the value a person creates and the value they ultimately receive from the process by which they created the value. So therefore, you can assert the claim that it is ultimately morally unjustifiable for someone to extract that surplus value when we have already existing structures that would allow them to, at minimum, decrease the amount of that surplus value that they are extracting to, let's say, only the necessary degree to which it is to keep the lights on and the business actually operating. You still need to generate capital in order to invest in the business, but the increase above and beyond that should be delivered back to the people who produce the value not someone who holds a slip of paper saying that they have legal rights to the means of production, either in terms of the actual employees, in terms of their labor contract, or the at will nature of employment that happens in actual capitalism, and the receipt for all the machines that they bought and things like that. This is the justification for the extraction of that value, which is ultimately, especially after paid back and not actually costing anything, unjustifiable compared to a system that would have the same kind of structures but a greater amount of distribution of that value back to those who created the value. That's how I would get the claim that it is not morally justified to maintain a capitalist relation, an employee-employee relationship.
Okay, but this presents a really interesting dynamic here, because I could just posit that, well, why don't we allow for cooperatives to exist within the capitalist system, and for anyone that wants to work within a more democratized workplace where the proceeds, the profit, the net profit from the organization are shared equally amongst members, well, they can go do that. They can just go do that anytime. But I would posit,
in principle, they could. I mean, not in practice, but in principle, they could.
Sure,
Yeah.
but from a psychology point of view, I would be surprised to find that everyone was willing to participate in a co-op. And I don't mean to. I've got so many questions. Oh man, we're definitely gonna have a follow-up session, because I've got so many questions still in the discussion points.
Yeah.
And then I've got this whole list of co-ops, but we're bleeding into it a little bit, I suppose, and that's fine.
Yeah.
One could posit that there is a certain type of person that has absolutely no interest in a democratized workplace.
Yeah.
They want to rock up in the morning. They have their meat pie and their coffee. They hit something with a hammer 1,000 times that day, and they work there for a set block of time, and then they go home and they play Xbox, and they have a beer, and then they go to bed.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
There's just, and I don't know what percentage of the population there is that's like that. Certainly you don't appear to be like that, and I'm probably not, as far as you can tell. But there's a proportion of the population that's like that. They don't care to know about how the business is run. They don't want to make a decision. They just want to rock up, do their job, go home, get paid, and they don't want to think about work outside of work.
Yeah.
How does someone like that, like if you had a completely what is the question that I'm trying to ask?
What if people don't want to go to the meetings?
Yeah.
They don't have to.
What? But they would have to in a communist system where democratized labor is happening.
I would the system I envision would be a system that would allow those that want to do so. So in the difference again, if we're trying to like compare the systems, right now you're precluded from doing it even if you want to, which tends to generate
starting a co-op.
No, you're precluded. Let's say in a traditional business where you're an employee, you are precluded from a seat on the decisions on business decisions. You are given decisions from the leadership, and you work towards those things.
Sure.
So you are precluded from those conversations, and sometimes from the conversations themselves, but definitely from the ability to decide on them or vote on them in terms of board meetings or something like that. So if we compare a system in which you're precluded from doing it, and we compare that to a system in which you're invited to, you're able to, both systems are able to handle those that don't want to. Obviously, the system that precludes it in many ways generates a lot of people who may not want to. But the system that allows people to doesn't force them to. So we're not, I mean, it always makes me, it's like somewhat ironic because like Australians are forced to vote, essentially.
Yeah.
And Americans aren't. And
that's the best solution, by the way.
to force
we have the highest
people to vote.
Yeah, absolutely. Because we have the highest participation rates in the world for voting.
But there is this idea that I think there is also a competing value, even if we're talking about morally, of a system that is less coercive would tend to be more morally justifiable than a system that's more coercive. And so
I don't know if that applies in this case though, because our system doesn't mean that you have to actually pick a party.
Yeah.
What it actually means is you have to rock up to the voting
Yeah.
booth, and you can put in a donkey vote.
Yeah,
You could draw a giant penis
Yeah.
on the voting form, and invalidate your vote, and that's perfectly fine.
Yeah.
But you have to rock up.
Yeah. Yep. And I in principle, like, I would even I don't agree with that in some ways. I think that may give you greater
Really?
it gets you greater participation rates, but it doesn't necessarily get you
It does.
better decision making. Because you don't want to coerce people who aren't interested in making those decisions to make the decisions, because then you're not orienting towards the kind of best decisions, or decisions that are made by people who actually care. And so to me, I want decisions made by people who actually care. So I want people who are going to self-select to be engaged in the sort of business decisions and these kind of like important decisions about what the company is going to do and how it's going to distribute the capital it's gained and the value it's generated and all these kinds of things. I want the people who care about that to participate in those discussions. And if you don't really care about that, then you can vote with your feet, and you can go home and drink a beer and play Xbox. That's cool with me. But if you want to sit in the 3-hour General Assembly at night and have discussions about how we should, reinvest or give dividends about the surplus value we've created, that should be open to anyone who wants to participate in it. And so again, as we compare a system that allows that to a system that precludes it, a system that allows it is at least morally more justifiable, and then I would argue would ultimately probably produce more socially advantageous
Equitable
or socially
outcomes.
socially it would produce ultimately what we might just shorthand as better outcomes, in terms of less perverse incentives towards poisoning people, or cutting corners, or doing something that would ultimately put people at risk, or put huge numbers of people at risk. That you would have a number of insurance policies in some ways, and actual sort of roadblocks in terms of decision making that would prevent people from making decisions that we recognize are made all the time, when the rubric is not the social the kind of social role of our organization, and instead the ruthless pursuit of profit, which ultimately produces a lot of bad incentives and decisions that you wouldn't take if you were considering other options, which is this attempt to create like stakeholder capitalism, or capitalism, human capitalism, or capitalism with a human face. It's this attempt to say, like, we really need a different rubric to decide what decisions we're going to make than like what makes the most profit, because sometimes what makes the most profit is socially, environmentally, culturally, politically damaging. And so there's attempts to like restructure this, but again, unfortunately, the core basis of the reason you have employer and employee, and it's called capitalism, is because that's what generates capital, and the whole goal of the system is to accumulate capital. So the quote-unquote winners of capitalism are Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, because they've got the most capital, and so they get the attention, and they're proposed and promoted in cultural life as the winners, the people that people want to be. Everybody wants to be Bill Gates, or wants to at least have the money. And so there's a reason. I don't know why I talked about them, to be honest, but there's the system is oriented to assist them.
Yeah, the prison system definitely. Yeah, the prison system definitely tends towards an extreme hierarchy, with a massive difference between the highest 1% and the lower 10% or something like
and
that.
I would
massive call
maldistribution of resources, and wealth.
But for a lot of people, that's not necessarily a problem, right? But
Yeah.
I don't want to go there. But I would, and I don't want to go here either. But I would just add that I feel like a winner under the capitalist system.
Yeah.
But we might come back to that another time. Oh, damn, I forgot the train of thought that I wanted to follow up on. Oh, no. Oh, okay.
Well, you know what?
Frustrating.
It's okay. I am seeing this approaching the 3-hour mark, and that I'm going to say that's
Yeah.
the mark.
Sure.
I do want to say, like, I appreciate you and I were both doing this, where we would say one might propose and one could argue that this, and I think often making the points that we actually hold, but in this somewhat abstracted version, so that we are not necessarily debating one another, but actually discussing
Yeah.
the different ideas, which I think is a very helpful tactic in terms of having a discussion where, I mean, I think you and I disagree on a few things, but we can pull it back in some ways and extract it a little bit so that we're not wedding ourselves as human beings to our ideas, and that we can see that
Yeah.
there's this gulf between them, and that, in that sense, we're both, at least in principle, willing to like change our minds based on a discussion that can abstract that, in that sense. And I think the subtitle for the whole podcast is a podcast for the rational left, and this is, I hope, a representation that leftists can be rational and can have discussions and do this kind of thing, because it is often, and I'm not sure how it is in Australia, maybe it's the same as America, but there's a tendency for people who present leftist views to do so in a way that is not rational, or not as easy
Or
to be able to
pejorative.
to be able to
Yeah.
abstract and differentiate human beings from their ideas, and realize that human beings are not fixed things that constantly maintain the same position, but they can, in principle, have their positions changed. And it's also, I'm almost always the one on this podcast asking questions, so it's actually kind of fun for me to be asked questions, because
Be
like
able to
I'm
respond.
always the one
Yeah.
that's I got the list of questions like you do, and I'm like, oh shit, I can only ask like 5 of these questions. What am I supposed to do? But like, it's also, the questions that you're asking are questions that a lot of people have, and they're very well formed questions in order to like cut through a lot of the rhetoric and a lot of the kind of nonsense, and they're particularly like well structured. But it's also, as you can tell, difficult to parse out all the different aspects of this. Like this whole perspective from me, especially like Marxism itself, right? Like it was interesting that you said what would be the thing that would prove sort of communism untenable or unable, right? And there was a sort of relief of like that you didn't ask what would invalidate Marxism, because that for me is actually a lot more difficult. Like I think that Marxism has a basic philosophical approach of this, and I would definitely like read a bit about this. Hegel, I think it's in the phenomenology of spirit, in the beginning, in like the preface. He explains this dialectical approach and like how it works, and it's well worth sort of reading and trying to. It's hard to read. Hegel's hard to read, but like that approach, this dialectical approach, is so helpful in understanding things, and even being able to have a conversation with someone you disagree with, because there is this, all of us and everything. I know that this is somewhat problematic to you, but like it's so helpful to take the base position that like everything has a problem. There's a problem somewhere. And in the course of dialogue, in the course of trying things, in the course of experimentation and experience, you begin to realize where things start to break down. And this kind of representation of entropy in individual lives becomes kind of apparent, and it leads to a kind of understanding that is less burdened by the desire for a kind of pure sense of objectivity or universal validity or universality, and instead, in some ways, sees the world as it is, which is not this beautifully structured system, but this massive web of complex interactions and engagements and again, historically, culturally, economically, and contingent things that produce the world that we live in, with all of its seeming systematicity and justifiability, and all of its like hidden problems and things like that we can, by adopting this notion that like there's a contradiction somewhere, and it's helpful for us to find it, because we can really learn something from that, as a like genuine approach, it's hard for me to think what would convince me otherwise on that. But I think unless it totally broke down in terms of describing how reality actually is and how the world actually is, save that. I it's hard for me to think what would convince me otherwise of like the Marxist position, which is like this 30,000-foot philosophical thing that might lead you to being an ardent communist. But there are a lot of Marxists who aren't communists, which sounds kind of weird. But they might have this dialectical materialist approach, but don't necessarily, again, see the proletariat as the agent of revolutionary change, and might see some other aspect of it that you can still maintain Marxism and get rid of communism in the same way that you can adopt a communist approach and know nothing about Marx. And so Marxism and communism are in some ways kind of different things, and it's just it's an interesting comment in the sense that we did focus a lot on like communism, and I think that's cool. But there's this whole other approach of Marxism that I do think I tried to bring in, and I somehow can't help but bring in, but also relates to some of the deeper questions of like morality and those kind of things that are necessary components of this whole conversation.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for the compliment of being able to have discourse in a rational way.
Yeah.
I'm certainly trying, and the technique that you're describing is actually one that I'm purposefully employing. It's like this. It's like this mechanism to. It's like you're watching yourself. It's like you're watching you're not the person asking the question. You're the person watching the person who's asking the question.
Yeah.
And it's this psychological approach to being able to discuss potentially contentious issues or topics or subjects without actually feeling like you need to get personally involved.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you do it really well as well. I was hoping you would. I was hoping that I would find someone who I could potentially discuss these long list of questions with in a really helpful way and actually get to the meat of it. The thing that I forgot just before was that I was going to compliment you on your providing a cogent response to the question of the fairness of the workplace and the fact that the worker co-ops allows for the ability. I don't know why I didn't see it. Of course, if you're working in a co-op, you don't have to participate in the democratic functioning and running of a workplace. Don't know why that didn't occur. The only rebuttal I would give is that conceptually it seems like you could have a fully functional working co-op in the capitalist system anyway, so that it seems like that's possible. But you've got to go. There's things I would really love to have a follow-up if you're interested.
This will be part one.
Yeah, I hope so too. Like, one of the really contentious things I wanted to get to, I'll give you a taste for maybe for next time, was in your Sensible Socialist podcast number 65. 33 minutes in, you're rebutting Sam Harris, and this is I may be misquoting, but it's something along the lines of, you were talking about the ridiculousness of the concept that someone who is rich would want to make money to help people. And you and your friends were laughing at this concept, and I was really offended. Okay. I was really offended by this discourse, because I mean, I know people who have gone into business with the express purpose of like employ. They didn't do it for themselves. Well, of course they did it for themselves. Yeah. But one of the primary goals of building that business was to actually provide employment for people who otherwise might not have had a job, and to actually help their community, right? And I personally have benefited from the capitalist system, because I started with less than nothing. And maybe we might talk about that some other time. Yeah. But part of the joy of my life is that I get to give back. As a prosperous person, I can give back to my community and my friends and my family. Yeah. And that's part of why I would want more money, riches, whatever you want to call it. So, yeah, I was really offended about that, and we definitely need to talk about that next time.
Yeah, The only little preview I would say is that I think part of the reason why there's a kind of smirk about that is because it's the recognition of an irony. The irony being, if you have the express goal of wanting to kind of help people, but you're
Why not become a doctor in Africa or something? Yeah. Yep.
that, or the means by which you create the wealth such that you would be able to engage in philanthropic exercises is uh, is again, like, sort of, I would say, problematic in the sense that it's not. You could make the argument that it's not helping people in a way that, at least comparatively, a system that didn't allow you, or didn't permit this extraction of surplus value would, quote unquote, be better for people, depending on, again, our axiomatic claims about what we're gonna say is better. But so it's
Sure.
it's just a recognition of a kind of irony where you say, like, the sort of cheap way to say it is like, I want to help people, so I'm going to exploit people so they can help people, right? There's a kind of, I know that that wealth is often a vehicle for people to do a lot of social good, and there's this notion that, like, I would just want to be rich so that I can be a philanthropist. But if you aren't recognizing the kind of means by which that wealth was generated for you, and then your private ability to put that wealth towards things that you want to, and not essentially kind of a general social benefit, that there's an irony there about the idea that the means by which you're going to engage in your philanthropy, your sort of focus on humanity, is by denying what one may argue is essential components to, quote unquote, humanity, being autonomy,
Right.
And this notion of fairness and stuff like that. And so
it's the irony of using a mechanism that is inherently wrong to try and do overall something that is right.
Yes,
I understand.
And it's not that isn't possible. I think that right now, there is a kind of perverse justification for engaging in some ways the least extractive, the least surplus value extractive employment relationship that you could do, again, towards people who may not otherwise have the ability to gain a living, because we're still living in the capitalist system. And so if we're going to judge one enterprise against another enterprise, there's going to be a significant difference between Amazon and its warehouses and the local I don't know, convenient store that hires troubled youth so that they'll have employment experience, so they don't immediately go to jail. I will totally allow for there to be some kind of spectrum on which we can judge a kind of business. But if the goal is to be, Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos rich, it's hard for me to see how the main goal for wanting to be that kind of obscenely rich is merely to help people. I think that there's reason to be suspicious of somebody whose endless pursuit of profit generates them an amount of capital and access to capital that they could never sufficiently and actually, like, implement. That it's literally just, like, sort of stored for the sake of kind of winning in some ways. And I think that's in some ways what we're laughing about. But it's a good call out in some sense. I think that you sit with four of your lefty friends and you adopt a kind of groupthink aspect where you can sort of laugh at this without breaking down the nuance, which is why it's important to have conversations with people for which you don't agree and aren't only living in the bubble of confirmation bias. So I take your point, and I apologize.
Yeah, and that was that. No. Don't worry about it. It's fine. I recognized that you were with friends. You were with your people.
Yeah.
And our language is always looser.
Yeah.
And we always take less care to not risk offending people when we're with people who we know will extend that mercy and compassion to us and shrug off any sort of eccentricities that we might have.
They'll get the inside joke,
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. Yeah. So it's not a problem at all. I'm not really offended. I was amused offended, if that makes sense.
Yep. Pleasantly offended.
Pleasantly amused and offended at the same time. Yeah, something like that. I really enjoyed this discussion.
Me too.
Found it quite helpful.
Absolutely.
You've opened my eyes a little bit.
Cool.
You have not converted me, but
Yep.
let's I don't know, maybe let's try again.
For sure. I only have two goals in a conversation. First, to create understanding. Second, see if I can move the needle. And I'm not. If I don't move the needle, it's fine. I'm more than happy to increase understanding.
Yeah, sure.
All right, man.
Thank you very much, man.
This part one concluded, but we'll do part 2 soon. I've really enjoyed talking.
I hope so too. Thank you very much.
Thank
All
you.
the best. Talk soon.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Sensible Socialist Podcast. This podcast is supported by listeners like you, and no advertisements or anything will ever be said. If you want to support the podcast, please go to patreon.com/sensiblesocialist and give today. Also, please give us a review or a rating on iTunes or wherever you listen to the podcast, as it greatly helps. All right. See you next time.